There is a kind of knowledge that biographers never get, no matter how many boxes of correspondence they open or how many former private secretaries agree to lunch. It is not secret in the way a scandal is secret. Nobody is hiding a letter about it in a vault at Windsor. It is simply untranslatable into the form a biography takes, because a biography is built out of paper, and this knowledge was never written down. It lived in hands. It lived in the particular way a woman stood still at 7 in the morning, while someone else adjusted a hemline she could not see, and would not ask about twice. Angela Kelly had that knowledge for close to 3 decades, and she carried more of it than any historian who ever queued for an appointment at the Royal Archives. Biographers reconstruct a monarch from the outside. They read dispatch boxes, minutes, letters that survived the fires and the shredders, the recollections of men who sat across a desk from her for 20 minutes twice a year. What they build is careful, often accurate, and permanently at one remove. Nobody who has only ever seen a queen across a desk can tell you what her hands looked like on a bad morning, or how she stood when a joint ached and she had decided nobody would notice. Angela Kelly could tell you that, because she was usually the one holding the other end of the sleeve. This is the story of how a working-class girl from a council house in Liverpool ended up closer to the physical person of Queen Elizabeth II than most of the men who wrote her biographies would ever get, and what that proximity actually meant, both for the woman who lived it and for an institution that had never quite worked out what to do with someone who mattered enormously and answered to nobody in the traditional chain. It is not a story about clothes, although clothes are where it starts. It is a story about the particular kind of trust that only gets built with your hands, over years, in rooms nobody is allowed to photograph. If you have found channels like this one useful for the parts of royal history that never made it into the official record, this is a good moment to subscribe, because there is a great deal more of it coming, and very little of it is the version you were handed at school. Before she ever touched a royal wardrobe, Angela Kelly grew up in Anfield, in Liverpool, in a household that had nothing to do with palaces and no particular reason to expect it ever would. Her father worked on the docks. Liverpool in the middle of the 20th century was a city built around the rhythm of ships coming in and going out, and a docker's daughter learned early that money arrived in uneven amounts and had to be managed with more skill than the amount itself would suggest. Kelly has spoken, in the limited and carefully worded way that royal staff are permitted to speak about their own lives, of a large family and a Catholic upbringing, the kind where discipline was not a theory but a daily fact, applied without much discussion and expected to be absorbed without much complaint. She trained as a seamstress. That single fact carries more weight than it sounds like it should. Sewing, properly learned, is not a decorative skill. It is closer to engineering in miniature. A seam has to hold weight and movement, and the specific unforgiving geometry of a human body that refuses to stay still. You cannot bluff your way through a badly cut sleeve. Either the arm moves freely or it does not, and there is no amount of charm that will talk a garment into fitting correctly. Kelly learned this trade the unglamorous way, through apprenticeship and repetition, long before anyone with a royal warrant knew her name. What happened next is the part of her story that tends to get compressed into a single sentence in most profiles, and it deserves more than that, because it is where the second half of her eventual skill set was built. She left Liverpool for West Germany, and she took work as a dressmaker attached to service households, first for the wife of the governor of Gibraltar, and later within a British military and diplomatic household in Germany. During the years the British Army maintained a substantial presence there. This was not glamorous work. It was structured, hierarchical, and demanding in a specific way that has almost nothing to do with fashion and almost everything to do with discretion. A military household runs on rules about who speaks to whom, who enters which room, what gets repeated outside the walls of the residence, and what gets forgotten the moment you leave the building. Kelly spent years absorbing that discipline before she ever set foot inside a British royal residence, and it shows in nearly everything she did afterward. She did not arrive at Buckingham Palace and learn discretion on the job. She arrived already fluent in it, the way a person who grew up bilingual does not think about grammar, because the grammar is simply how the world works. There is a pattern worth noticing here, one that recurs across the small number of people who ever got genuinely close to Queen Elizabeth II in a working capacity. It was rarely the products of Eton and the Foreign Office who ended up trusted with the parts of her life that were actually private. It was, again and again, people who had spent years inside disciplined, hierarchical, low-visibility institutions that were adjacent to power without being power itself: service households, the military, the professional trades that keep a large establishment functioning without ever appearing in the photograph. Tommy Lascelles came up through the traditional route and earned his authority through paperwork, memoranda, and the accumulated weight of decades inside the machinery of the private secretary's office. Angela Kelly came up through a different and much less documented route, and the authority she eventually held was not written into any organizational chart. It existed because one person trusted her completely, and that person happened to be the sovereign. She joined the royal household in the mid-90s, 1994 to be precise. Hired as a dresser, one tier of a system that most people outside the household have never had reason to think about. A dresser is not a stylist in the modern celebrity sense. There is no red carpet logic to the job, no chasing of trends, no styling credit at the bottom of a magazine page. A royal dresser manages the physical reality of a wardrobe that has to function under conditions almost nobody else's clothing has to survive. It has to look correct in photographs taken from every angle, in every weather, for hours at a stretch, on a body that is aging in real time across the decades the job lasts. It has to allow for movement that a fashion designer never has to plan for: curtsies, long stretches of standing, getting in and out of cars dozens of times in a single day, waving with an arm that has to stay comfortable for far longer than any photograph will show. Nobody writes a biography chapter about hemlines calibrated for wind on an open-air platform, but somebody has to solve that problem every single week, and for nearly 30 years that somebody was Angela Kelly. The rise from dresser to something considerably larger happened slowly, and slowness is the important part. Palaces do not hand out trust in a single dramatic gesture. They extend it in small increments, testing each one before offering the next, and the testing never really stops. What began as a job confined to garments expanded, year by year, into something the household eventually had to invent new language to describe. By the time her role was fully formalized, Kelly's title read Personal Assistant, Advisor and Curator to Her Majesty the Queen, of Jewelry, Insignia, and Wardrobe, a mouthful of a job description that tried, not entirely successfully, to capture something that had outgrown any single function. She was not simply managing clothes anymore. She had become one of the small handful of people the Queen actually relied on for daily company, for judgment, and for the particular kind of honesty that only survives inside relationships built on years of proximity rather than years of protocol. This is the part that made courtiers uneasy, and it is worth being direct about why. The traditional royal household runs on a fairly rigid hierarchy, one where authority tends to correlate with a recognizable set of credentials: a public school, a good regiment, a spell in the Foreign Office or the household cavalry, a name that already appears in Burke's peerage before the person attached to it ever draws a salary from the crown. Angela Kelly had none of that. She had a Liverpool accent that she never lost and apparently never tried to lose, a background in service households rather than diplomatic ones, and absolutely no interest in pretending to be something she was not. What she had instead was something the traditional hierarchy could not manufacture, no matter how many generations of breeding it stacked on top of itself. She had the Queen's actual daily trust, earned in 1,000 small private moments that no memorandum ever recorded, and that kind of trust does not care what school you went to. The friction this produced inside the household was real, and it followed a pattern that shows up again and again in the history of institutions built around a single person at the top. Whenever someone gains power through direct personal loyalty, rather than through the institution's own approved channels, the institution gets uncomfortable, because that kind of power cannot be managed the normal way. You cannot demote it in an org chart review. You cannot outrank it with seniority. The only thing that can end it is the loyalty itself running out. And as long as the person at the top keeps choosing to trust the same individual, everyone else in the hierarchy simply has to live with an authority structure that does not run through them. Some courtiers reportedly found this difficult for years. Angela Kelly kept a set of keys that opened doors most senior officials never touched, and she used them. and there was very little anyone below the sovereign herself could do about it. The doctrine that eventually made Kelly's public reputation, the one journalists reached for whenever they profiled her, is often boiled down to a single sentence, attributed to the Queen herself, that she needed to be seen to be believed. It sounds like a slogan, and by the time it had been printed in enough newspapers, it had become one. But the underlying logic behind it was rigorous in a way that slogans rarely are. A monarch attending an engagement is usually visible to most of the crowd only as a small figure at considerable distance, framed by security barriers, television cameras, and several hundred other people's raised phones. Color, in that context, is not decoration. It is information. A bright, saturated, unmistakable block of color tells someone standing 200 meters back, in the rain, over the heads of a crowd, exactly where to look, and confirms that yes, that is her, she came, she is here. Kelly reportedly worked from something close to a color wheel logic, choosing outfits with the visibility of the specific venue and crowd in mind, rather than the preferences of fashion editors who would review the outfit from 3 feet away under studio lighting the following morning. It was a system built for a job most designers never have to think about, which is dressing a single person so that thousands of strangers standing very far away can feel, correctly, that they were close enough to see her. That principle shaped some of the more memorable moments of the Queen's later public life, moments that read very differently once you understand the mechanics sitting underneath them. The emerald green worn during the state visit to Ireland in 2011 was not simply a flattering color choice. It read as a considered, almost diplomatic signal in a visit loaded with historical weight, the first state visit by a British monarch to the Republic of Ireland, and every visual choice attached to it was scrutinized for meaning by people on both sides of a very old wound. Kelly understood, in a way few outsiders fully appreciated at the time, that clothing in that setting was not neutral. It was doing part of the diplomatic work. The clearest public demonstration of just how far that trust extended came in the summer of 2012, during the opening ceremony of the London Olympics, when the Queen appeared to leave Buckingham Palace by helicopter alongside the actor Daniel Craig, playing James Bond, and parachute into the Olympic Stadium. It remains, more than a decade later, one of the strangest and most disarming things a reigning British monarch has ever agreed to do on camera, and it did not happen because a television producer talked a reluctant 86-year-old monarch into it against her better judgment. It happened because the people she trusted most, including Angela Kelly, understood exactly how far she was willing to go, understood the boundaries of her sense of humor and her sense of dignity well enough to know the two were not actually in conflict here, and helped build a sequence that let her be genuinely funny without ever once looking undignified. That is a harder needle to thread than it sounds. A great many advisors, given the same brief, would have talked her out of it entirely, certain that any risk to the institution's gravity was a risk not worth taking. The people around her in 2012 knew her well enough to take the risk, and the sequence became one of the most beloved pieces of royal television in living memory, precisely because it was not a mistake. It was a calculated act of trust in her own instincts, built by people who had spent years learning exactly where those instincts could be relied upon. 2 books eventually carried Kelly's name into print, and both of them tell you something about how unusual her position had become. The first, published in 2012 to accompany the Diamond Jubilee, documented the wardrobe built for that year's celebrations, an official Royal Collection Trust publication that functioned as much as institutional record as personal memoir. The second, published in 2019 and titled The Other Side of the Coin, went considerably further, offering an account, authorized directly by the Queen, of Kelly's own life and her working relationship with the sovereign across more than 2 decades. For a member of the royal household staff to publish a book about their working life with the monarch's own blessing, was close to unprecedented. Household staff do not typically write books. They sign confidentiality undertakings, and they keep them for the rest of their lives, and the entire culture of royal service depends on almost everyone involved, understanding that the correct response to a direct question from a journalist is a polite version of nothing at all. That the Queen personally authorized an exception for Kelly tells you, more clearly than any anecdote could, exactly how much latitude this particular relationship had accumulated over the years. It is worth being honest about what the book actually contained, because the honest answer complicates the easy version of this story. The other side of the coin was warm, personal in tone, and genuinely revealing about the practical mechanics of dressing a monarch, the color system, the fittings, the small rituals of a working relationship built across decades. It was also, by any reasonable standard, careful. There is very little in it that would embarrass the institution, almost nothing about the private conversations that must have taken place across 30 years of proximity, and nothing at all resembling the kind of unguarded material that tends to surface only after a subject has died, and the people who knew them feel released from the obligations that kept them silent while she lived. Kelly wrote, with permission, exactly as much as a person who intended to remain trusted for the rest of her career could safely write, and not one sentence more. That restraint is itself a kind of evidence. It shows a woman who understood precisely where the line sat, and who had absorbed, from years inside disciplined service households before she ever reached the palace, an instinct for discretion so complete that permission to publish did not loosen it. Reports at the time suggested the book still produced discomfort inside parts of the household, less because of anything it revealed than because of the precedent it set. If a dresser could publish an authorized memoir with the sovereign's blessing, the unspoken question hanging over the rest of the staff was obvious enough. What did that mean for the wall of silence everyone else was still expected to maintain without exception? The unease was less about Kelly specifically than about what her example implied for an entire system built on the assumption that nobody, however close, ever gets to publish anything at all. This is where the title of this piece stops being a marketing phrase and starts meaning something specific, because there is a category of knowledge that simply does not survive the translation into a biography, no matter how skilled the biographer or how many people they interview. A biographer works from testimony, and testimony has a filter built into it. People choose what to say. Even the most candid former courtier, sitting down for an oral history interview 40 years after the fact, is still choosing, consciously or not, which memories to hand over and which to keep. A dresser does not get that filter, not in the moment the work is actually happening. You cannot selectively remember whether a hand was steady while you are the one holding it steady. You cannot decide, after the fact, not to have noticed that a shoe no longer fit the way it used to because the foot underneath it had changed shape with age. That knowledge arrives whether you want it or not, and it arrives in the body, not in the kind of tidy anecdote that survives being repeated at a dinner party 30 years later. The last years of Queen Elizabeth's reign made this dimension of Kelly's work publicly visible in a way that decades of tightly controlled image management had mostly prevented. From the autumn of 2021 onward, the public record shows a steady accumulation of small, carefully worded announcements, an episodic mobility problem here, an engagement withdrawn there, a walking stick that appeared and then simply never went away again. Buckingham Palace, true to a communications style built up over 70 years, never offered more detail than the minimum required, and the minimum required, by that point, kept shrinking further with each passing month. What the public saw was a monarch appearing less often, moving more carefully when she did appear, and eventually conducting even the most symbolically important ceremonies of state from a chair rather than standing. What the public did not see, and what no biographer working from documents alone will ever be able to fully reconstruct, is the daily mechanical reality behind those announcements. Somebody had to work out, morning after morning, how to dress a woman in her 90s, whose body no longer cooperated the way it once had, in garments that still had to look, on camera, exactly as composed and unremarkable as they had 30 years earlier. Somebody had to solve for a hemline on a day when standing for the length of a ceremony was itself a genuine physical challenge, for sleeves that needed to allow a stiffening shoulder its full range without ever appearing loose, for shoes that had to look identical to the shoes in every previous decade of photographs, while quietly accommodating feet that had changed. None of that work photographs. None of it makes it into a press release. All of it happened in a room with the door closed, between two women, one of whom was determined that the public record should show continuity and dignity right up until the final appearance, and the other of whom had spent nearly 30 years becoming the person best equipped in the entire world to make that continuity look effortless. There is a comparison worth drawing here, and it goes back to a very different kind of royal servant, the paper-based courtier of an earlier generation, the Tommy Lascelles model. Lascelles managed crisis through memoranda, through the careful drafting of language, through knowing precisely which sentence to remove from a speech before it reached the microphone. His discretion was intellectual. It lived in judgment calls about phrasing and timing, the kind of skill that leaves a trail, however faint, in the archive, because paper survives. Kelly's discretion was physical, and physical discretion leaves almost nothing behind. There is no memorandum recording the choice to let out a seam an extra half-inch without ever mentioning why. There is no minute recording the decision to build a hidden support into a coat's construction so that a frail shoulder would not have to bear weight it could no longer easily carry. That kind of judgment happens in silence, gets executed with a needle and thread, and then simply disappears into a garment that looks, to every camera in the world, like nothing had changed at all. A biographer working entirely from the paper record would have no way to know it ever happened. This is, in the end, the actual answer to the question the title poses. What did Angela Kelly see that no biographer ever did? She saw the ordinary physical vulnerability of an extraordinarily guarded life, up close, for decades, without ever once being the person who got to decide what the public was allowed to know about it. She saw a woman get older in the way every human being gets older, and she spent nearly 30 years making sure the institution's public face never had to show it a moment before the institution itself was ready. That is not the kind of material that turns up in an official biography. Not because biographers are lazy, but because the material was never written down anywhere they could find it. It lived, entirely, in a working relationship between two women, one of them a monarch and the other a docker's daughter from Anfield, and it stayed there. The institutional friction around Kelly's position did not stay abstract. It surfaced, periodically, in ways that made the newspapers, usually filtered through the careful anonymity that palace sourcing always demands. An unnamed courtier here, a former staff member speaking on condition of anonymity there. The broad shape of the reporting across those years was consistent even when the specific details varied. Kelly held a grace and favour apartment inside the walls of Buckingham Palace itself, a level of proximity to the monarch's own household that very few staff members, of any rank, were ever granted. She had, by multiple accounts, keys that opened rooms across several royal residences, not merely the Queen's private apartments, but storerooms, archives, and spaces that in an earlier era would have been the exclusive domain of the Lord Chamberlain's office. She was, according to more than one profile written across the 2 decades of her ascent, occasionally referred to inside palace circles by a nickname that acknowledged, half admiringly and half warily, just how much informal authority she had accumulated. None of that authority appeared on any official chart. All of it was real, and everyone inside the building knew it was real, because everyone inside the building had, at one point or another, needed her cooperation to get something done. It is worth pausing on why this specific kind of power tends to unsettle institutions built the way the British monarchy is built. Traditional courtier authority is legible. Everyone understands what a private secretary can and cannot do, because the role has existed for centuries, and the boundaries have been tested and retested by generations of occupants. A private secretary's power is institutional. It survives the person holding it, because the office itself carries the authority forward to whoever is appointed next. Kelly's power was the opposite of that. It was entirely personal, contingent on one specific relationship between one specific employer and one specific employee, and it would evaporate the instant that relationship ended, whether through retirement, dismissal, or the death of the person who had granted it. Institutions are generally comfortable with power they can chart, and uncomfortable with power that only exists because two people trust each other. The comfortable kind can be managed, promoted, demoted, and eventually replaced without much disruption. The uncomfortable kind cannot be managed at all. It can only be waited out. That waiting ended in September of 2022, when Queen Elizabeth II died at Balmoral, at the age of 96, after a reign that had run for 70 years, longer than almost anyone alive had been able to remember any other reigning monarch. The public mourning that followed was vast, choreographed down to details that had been planned for years under the codename Operation London Bridge, and almost entirely focused, as it should have been, on the sovereign herself. Very little of the coverage in those weeks had space for the woman who had spent nearly 30 years managing the physical detail of that same sovereign's public life. That absence is, in its own way, exactly consistent with everything this piece has been describing. The people closest to the literal physical fact of a monarch's existence are, by design and by long institutional habit, the people least likely to appear in the story of her death. What is publicly known about Kelly's position in that final period is limited, and it should stay limited here, rather than expanding into the kind of speculative texture that a less careful account might reach for. She had been, by every available account across the preceding decade, one of the handful of people the Queen trusted with the most sensitive and physically intimate parts of her daily life, and there is no public reporting suggesting that closeness diminished as the Queen's health declined through her final 2 years. Beyond that broad fact, the specific texture of those final months belongs to the small circle of people who were actually present, and very little of it has been made public, by Kelly or by anyone else. That silence is not a gap in the record waiting to be filled with invention. It is the same discretion this entire piece has been describing, still operating, right up to the end. The aftermath, by contrast, has been reported with considerably more detail, much of it less flattering to the institution than the story of the preceding 30 years. Following the Queen's death, reports across British newspapers described a markedly different relationship between Kelly and the household being assembled under King Charles III, one shaped by a broader effort to slim down the size and cost of the royal establishment that the new king had signalled he intended to pursue. Kelly's role, built entirely around a personal bond with the previous monarch, did not transfer automatically to the next one, and reports from the period described friction, uncertainty about her future position, and eventually a departure from full-time royal service. Some reporting went further, describing a formal employment dispute during the period surrounding her exit, the kind of dry legal process that sits uneasily alongside 3 decades of headlines about laughter, trust, and a queen who reportedly could not begin her day without her. None of that later reporting has ever produced anything resembling the warmth of the earlier coverage, and the contrast between the two periods tells its own story about how quickly personal loyalty, however deep, stops being an asset the moment the person who granted it is no longer alive to keep granting it. Across her decades of service, Kelly received honours that marked, in the institution's own formal language, just how unusual her contribution had been judged to be. She was appointed a member of the Royal Victorian Order and later advanced further within that order, an honour system built specifically to recognise personal service to the sovereign rather than public office or national achievement. The kind of award that exists almost entirely to say, in the driest possible institutional language, that this person mattered to the monarch personally, not merely professionally. It is a small, formal acknowledgement of something the rest of this piece has been trying to describe in considerably more words, that the relationship between Angela Kelly and Queen Elizabeth II was never really about wardrobe management at all, however much the official job title insisted on saying otherwise. The pattern Kelly's career traces is not unique to her, and it is worth widening the lens for a moment to see the shape more clearly. The British monarchy has a long and fairly consistent history of depending completely on people it never fully absorbs into its own formal structure. Marion Crawford, known to generations of readers simply as Crawfie, spent 17 years as governess to the young Princess Elizabeth and Princess Margaret, closer to the two future queens during their formative years than almost anyone outside their own parents, and was cast out of royal favour entirely, permanently and without appeal, the moment she published a single relatively gentle memoir about her time in the role. Ruth Fermoy spent decades as one of the Queen Mother's closest companions and, in her final significant act of service to the institution, gave testimony after the fact that helped the palace manage the fallout from her own granddaughter's candid interviews about the breakdown of a royal marriage, loyalty to the crown running, in the end, deeper than loyalty to her own family. Robert Fellows served as private secretary through some of the most damaging years the institution has ever weathered, and has maintained total public silence about nearly all of it for more than 2 decades since his retirement. Each of these figures, in radically different ways and at radically different levels of the household hierarchy, illustrates the same underlying arrangement. The institution asks for total discretion, offers proximity and a kind of provisional, revocable trust in exchange, and reserves the right to withdraw all of it the moment circumstances change, without much regard for how many years of loyal service preceded the withdrawal. Kelly's version of this pattern has one important variation worth naming directly, because it is the variation that makes her story different in kind from Crawfey's or Fermoy's or Fellowes's, and it is the variation this entire piece has been building toward. The others managed information, protected reputations, and shaped the institution's public narrative through words, testimony, silence, and occasionally its opposite. Kelly managed a body. She was trusted, for nearly 30 years, with the single most literal and least abstract dimension of a monarch's existence. The physical fact of her, the part that cannot be redrafted, cannot be spun, cannot be managed through a carefully worded press statement, because it is simply there, visible, on camera, in front of the entire world, whenever the monarch leaves a building. That is a different category of trust from the kind extended to a private secretary drafting a paragraph of a speech. A private secretary who makes a mistake produces an awkward sentence that gets quietly corrected before publication. A dresser who makes a mistake produces a photograph, seen instantly by millions of people, that cannot be corrected or withdrawn afterward. The margin for error in Kelly's job was, in a very real sense, narrower than in almost any other role inside the household, and she operated inside that narrow margin, in public, multiple times a week, for close to 3 decades, without a single visible failure that anyone can point to. It is worth spending a little time on what a single working day actually required, because the scale of the logistics tends to disappear behind the elegant simplicity of the finished result, which is exactly the point of good design work of any kind. The labor should be invisible, so that only the outcome remains. A single significant public engagement, a state visit, a garden party, an opening of Parliament, involved planning that began not hours but often weeks in advance, coordinating color against the specific setting of the venue, against the season, against the other attendees whose own outfits had to be considered so that nothing clashed and nothing competed, against the practical demands of the day itself, how long the standing would last, whether there would be steps to manage, whether wind or rain were likely, and what that meant for hats, hemlines, and the particular challenge of keeping a monarch looking composed, in weather that would defeat most ordinary people's composure within minutes. Fittings happened in private, in rooms with the door closed, at hours that fit around a schedule that belonged, first and always, to the institution rather than to either of the 2 women actually doing the work. None of it was rushed. Everything about the process was built around the assumption that dignity, once lost in a single bad photograph, is far harder to recover than it was to maintain in the first place. The Diamond Jubilee year, 2012, offers a useful case study in what that planning looked like at its most demanding, because it compressed an entire calendar year of major public appearances into a single concentrated stretch of months, each one requiring its own carefully considered wardrobe, and each one photographed and analyzed by more press attention than almost any other year of the reign outside of the coronation itself and the funerals that eventually bookended it. The book Kelly published that same year, documenting the wardrobe built for the Jubilee, exists as close to a primary source as this subject will ever produce, an official account, sanctioned by the Royal Collection Trust, of exactly how much deliberate thought sat behind outfits that most viewers, watching a river pageant or a service of Thanksgiving on television, would have registered for perhaps 3 or 4 seconds before the broadcast moved on to the next shot. 3 or 4 seconds of viewer attention, purchased by weeks of invisible labor. That ratio, more than almost any other detail in this story, captures what the job actually was. The relationship was not, by every account that has emerged from people willing to speak, even in the guarded, half-anonymous way palace sources typically speak, a purely functional one. Kelly herself, in the limited public remarks she has made across the years, described a bond built on genuine warmth and notably on laughter, an element that tends to surprise people whose entire mental image of Queen Elizabeth II was built from decades of formal engagements and a public manner that rarely cracked into open amusement on camera. Multiple accounts, including Kelly's own authorized book, describe a private relationship considerably lighter than the public image, one where teasing ran in both directions, where Kelly was reportedly one of a vanishingly small number of people inside the household permitted to be genuinely funny with the sovereign, rather than simply deferential toward her. That detail matters more than it might first appear. Humor requires a specific kind of safety. You cannot make a joke at someone's expense, even a gentle one, unless you are confident the relationship can absorb it without damage, and very few people in Queen Elizabeth's adult life, family included, ever occupied a position secure enough to take that risk regularly. Kelly, by multiple accounts, did. The corgis, and later the dorgies that joined them, offer a small but telling window into the same dynamic. The Queen's dogs were, famously, an intensely private preoccupation, one of the few areas of her life where staff involvement was kept to an unusually tight circle, partly for practical reasons, and partly because the dogs represented something closer to genuine private pleasure in a life otherwise almost entirely consumed by public duty. Kelly's involvement with that circle, reported across several profiles over the years, was another small data point in the larger picture, another sign that her position had moved well beyond the boundaries a job title like curator of wardrobe would normally imply, and into the considerably smaller category of people trusted with the parts of the Queen's life that had nothing to do with the crown at all. The final 2 years of the reign put this entire dynamic under a kind of pressure it had never faced before, because they combined declining physical health with the specific, brutal constraints of a global pandemic. Prince Philip's funeral in April of 2021 produced one of the most quietly devastating images of the entire reign. The Queen sitting alone in St. George's Chapel, separated by pandemic restrictions from every family member who might otherwise have sat beside her, dressed in black, wearing a face mask, watching her husband of 73 years be laid to rest without a single hand to hold. The mourning wardrobe for that day carried weight far beyond its actual physical fabric, and whatever discussions took place about how to dress a grieving widow for a funeral, the entire world would be watching, under conditions that stripped away every normal comfort a state occasion would otherwise provide, happened in the same closed rooms this entire piece has been describing. Nothing about that day looked improvised. Nothing about it looked wrong. Getting a single detail wrong, on a day already stripped of nearly everything that might have made it bearable, was simply not an option that either woman involved in preparing for it was willing to entertain. The Platinum Jubilee, in June of 2022, arrived only 14 months later and told a very different story about the same underlying reality. Public appearances that year were curtailed sharply and without much precedent in the modern reign. A monarch who had rarely missed a major national occasion in 70 years now appearing only briefly on the palace balcony for a handful of the 4 days of celebration built in her honor, her presence at the accompanying service of Thanksgiving withdrawn entirely at short notice on medical advice. Every one of those brief balcony appearances still had to be built with the same exacting care as every appearance that had come before it across the previous 7 decades, because the stakes, if anything, had risen rather than fallen. A monarch appearing rarely, and visibly frail when she did appear, needed every detail of those few minutes to communicate continuity, competence, and quiet strength rather than vulnerability, and that communication happened almost entirely through the choices made in a room nobody was allowed to photograph, hours before the public ever saw the result. If you want to understand how thoroughly royal households have always depended on labor they refuse to formally acknowledge, this is the moment to pause and look at the pattern stretching back long before Angela Kelly was born. Subscribe if that kind of pattern interests you, because the rest of this piece spends considerable time inside it. Go back further than Crawford, further than Fermoy, further than any 20th century name, and the shape of the arrangement stays remarkably constant. Aristocratic and royal households across British history have always run on a foundation of domestic labor, performed almost entirely by women, almost entirely from working or lower middle-class backgrounds, almost entirely unrecorded by the historical sources that later get used to write the official story. Ladies' maids, dressers, seamstresses, nursery staff, the entire below-stairs apparatus of a great house, existed in enormous numbers across the 18th and 19th centuries, and left behind almost no first-person testimony of their own, because the people doing the work were rarely literate enough to write memoirs, and rarely encouraged to if they were, and because the entire culture of service was built around the assumption that discretion meant permanent silence, not silence until retirement. What survives from those centuries is almost entirely the perspective of the family being served, preserved in letters and diaries, and the kind of correspondence historians can actually access, while the people who dressed, fed, and physically cared for that family across decades vanish from the record almost completely, present only as an occasional unnamed mention, a servant fetched, a maid summoned, never a name attached to a personality or a life outside the walls of the house. Angela Kelly's career represents something genuinely unusual, set against that centuries-deep pattern, not because the underlying labor was different in kind. Dressing and physically caring for a member of a royal family remains, at its core, remarkably similar work, whether it is being performed in the 19th century or the 21st. But because the 21st century media environment, combined with a monarch willing to grant an unusual degree of personal recognition, finally let a small amount of that labor surface into public visibility during the worker's own lifetime rather than only after her death, if at all. That visibility was still tightly controlled, still filtered through what an institution built on centuries of managed silence was willing to permit. But it was visibility all the same, and it makes Kelly one of the very few people in the entire multi-century history of this kind of work whose name is actually attached, in her own lifetime, to the specific reality of what she did. It would be a mistake, though, to let that visibility slide into an uncomplicated feel-good narrative, because a more skeptical reading of the entire Angela Kelly story is available, and it deserves a fair hearing rather than a dismissal. The skeptical version goes roughly like this. Every warm anecdote about laughter and trust that made its way into print did so with the explicit permission of the palace communications machinery. At a moment, the institution judged useful for its own image, presenting a beloved elderly monarch as approachable, human, and capable of genuine warmth toward an ordinary working-class woman from Liverpool, a story that flattered the institution as much as it flattered Kelly herself. On this reading, Kelly's authorized book was not really an act of unusual trust-breaking with 300 years of enforced silence. It was, instead, a carefully managed piece of image management dressed up as intimacy, released at a moment when the monarchy benefited considerably from being seen as warmer and less remote than its critics claimed, and withdrawn from further openness the instant it stopped serving that purpose, which is more or less exactly what happened once the Queen died and the new household under King Charles apparently found considerably less use for the same relationship. That skeptical reading is not wrong, exactly. It is almost certainly true that the palace communications operation approved every word of Kelly's book with an eye toward how it would land, and it is almost certainly true that the institution's willingness to celebrate her closeness cooled sharply once the specific monarch who valued that closeness was no longer alive to insist on it. Institutions manage their own image, and the British monarchy has been doing it with unusual sophistication for longer than almost any other institution on earth. None of that, however, actually undermines the central claim this piece has been making, which is a narrower and more specific one than a simple story about warmth and trust. The claim is not that the institution was generous or sincere in how it handled Kelly's story. The claim is that the physical, bodily, hands-on knowledge she accumulated across nearly 30 years is real, regardless of how carefully the institution later chose to package or withhold it, and that no biographer working from documents, interviews, and the official record could ever reconstruct it with the same completeness, because most of it was never written down, was never meant to be written down, and exists now, if it exists anywhere accessible at all, only in the memory of one woman who has shown, across 3 decades, an almost total commitment to keeping it there. Nothing illustrates the difference between sanctioned intimacy and betrayal quite as sharply as the case of Paul Burrell, and it is worth setting his story briefly alongside Kelly's, because the contrast tells you almost everything about how the institution actually decides which insiders get to speak. Burrell served as butler to Diana, Princess of Wales, close enough to her private life that he described himself, in the years after her death, as her rock. a description she is reported to have used of him herself while she was alive. In the aftermath of her death in 1997, Burrell retained a large quantity of her belongings, and in 2001, he was arrested and charged with theft. The case went to trial in 2002 and collapsed abruptly midway through when the Queen recalled, in a private conversation with the Prince of Wales, that Burrell had told her years earlier he was holding some of Diana's papers for safekeeping, a recollection that surfaced only after the trial had already begun and that effectively destroyed the prosecution's case. Burrell was never convicted of anything. He went on, not long afterward, to publish a memoir, A Royal Duty, describing his years of service to Diana in considerable and often uncomfortable detail, and the institutional and public reaction was immediate, severe, and almost entirely negative. He was widely condemned, inside royal circles and in a large section of the press, as a man who had broken a sacred trust for money, regardless of the fact that his description of himself as Diana's rock had, by every account, been something close to the literal truth while she was alive. Set that story next to Kelly's authorized book, published with the Queen's own explicit blessing barely 2 decades later, and the underlying logic becomes almost uncomfortably clear. The difference between a devastating betrayal and a warmly received act of institutional openness was never really about the content of what was disclosed. Burrell's account of Diana was, by most measures, less intimate and less physically detailed than Kelly's account of the Queen. The difference was authorization. Kelly published because the sovereign herself decided the moment and the content served the institution's interests. Burrell published without that blessing, after a princess who could no longer grant or withhold permission had already died, and he paid for the absence of that permission with a reputation that never fully recovered. The lesson sitting underneath both stories, once you place them side by side, is not really about loyalty or betrayal at all. It is about who holds the authority to decide what counts as loyalty in the first place, and that authority, in this institution, has only ever belonged to one person at a time. Kelly understood this, evidently, at an instinctive level, and it may be the single most important professional skill she brought to the job, more important even than the sewing or the color theory or the decades of accumulated trust. She knew, with a precision that took most other people inside the household considerably longer to develop, exactly what could be said and exactly what had to stay unsaid, and she calibrated her one significant act of public disclosure so precisely to the boundary of what the institution would accept that the book actually strengthened her position rather than damaging it, a nearly unheard-of outcome for a member of staff publishing anything at all about their working life inside the palace. That calibration is not a small skill. It is arguably the rarest skill in the entire history of royal service, the ability to speak just enough to satisfy public curiosity about a genuinely fascinating relationship while disclosing almost nothing that the institution would ever regret having allowed into print. There is a specific, frequently repeated anecdote from that book that captures the texture of the relationship better than almost anything else on record, one that has circulated widely enough across press coverage of Kelly's career to count as close to settled public knowledge, even allowing for the fact that the precise wording tends to shift slightly depending on which outlet is quoting it. Kelly has described being one of the very few people trusted to give the Queen an honest opinion, told directly and without the softening that surrounded almost every other interaction the sovereign had across a normal day, about whether an outfit actually worked or did not, whether a color read correctly under a particular light, whether the whole effect achieved what it needed to achieve. In an environment built almost entirely around deference, where the overwhelming majority of people the Queen encountered on any given day were, by training and by instinct, inclined to agree with whatever she suggested, rather than risk contradicting her, having even one person willing to say, plainly, that something was not quite right, was apparently valued by the Queen far beyond what the modest practical stakes of a wardrobe choice would normally justify. It was not really about the clothes, it was about having one relationship, out of the many hundreds she maintained across a working lifetime, where flattery was not the default currency. It helps to understand what Anfield actually was in the middle of the 20th century, because the neighborhood shaped the woman long before the palace ever had the chance to. This was not the version of Anfield that exists today, defined almost entirely by the football stadium and the tourism built around it. It was a dense, working-class district, built around the rhythm of the nearby docks, terraced streets where nearly every household depended, directly or indirectly, on the same industry, and where the boundaries between neighbors barely existed in the way they might in a more affluent suburb. Doors were left unlocked. Children were raised collectively, in the sense that any adult on the street had informal license to correct a misbehaving child who was not their own, and nobody thought twice about it. Money moved in the uneven rhythm dockwork always produced, good weeks and lean weeks, ships arriving on their own schedule rather than a predictable monthly wage, and households across the district learned to manage that unevenness the way people everywhere learn to manage what they cannot control, through careful budgeting, mutual obligation, and a fairly unsentimental relationship with hardship. Catholic identity in that specific corner of Liverpool was not a private, Sunday-only matter. It structured the week, the school, the local parish, and a considerable amount of the social calendar. In a city that had, across generations of Irish immigration through the port, developed one of the largest and most tightly bound Catholic communities anywhere in England. Discipline in that world tended to be firm. Physical correction was not unusual by the standards of the era, and the underlying expectation, repeated in one form or another in nearly every household on the street, was that a person's worth showed itself through work, through reliability, and through never complaining louder than the situation actually warranted. None of that made for an easy childhood by modern standards, but it built a specific kind of resilience, the sort that treats genuine hardship as simply a Tuesday, and that resilience turns out to matter enormously once you follow Kelly's career forward into a working environment that demanded exactly that quality, for decades, without ever once officially acknowledging how much it was asking. Large families were the norm rather than the exception in that generation of that neighborhood, and Kelly has referred, across various interviews given over the years, to growing up as one of several children. The household budget stretched across more mouths than it comfortably supported, the older children absorbing responsibility for the younger ones almost as a matter of course. Precise numbers vary slightly across different accounts and should be treated with appropriate caution rather than repeated as settled fact. But the general picture that emerges, consistently, across every profile ever written about her early life, is unmistakable. This was a household where nothing arrived easily, where a girl learned early that skill was the one form of currency nobody could take away from her once she had actually earned it, and where the eventual decision to leave Liverpool altogether, in search of a trade that might offer something more than the docks could ever offer, would have felt less like ambition and more like simple common sense. The decision to train as a seamstress deserves more attention than the single sentence it usually receives in profile pieces, because the trade itself carried a specific cultural weight in post-war working-class Liverpool that has mostly been forgotten. Dressmaking and tailoring offered one of the very few respectable, skilled paths available to a working-class girl who had left school at the earliest legal opportunity, a route that did not require the capital a small business would need, did not require the connections a clerical career in the city centre would need, and rewarded precisely the qualities that discipline and hardship had already instilled: patience, exactness, and the willingness to unpick a mistake and redo it correctly, rather than pass off shoddy work as finished. An apprenticeship in dressmaking in that era typically ran for several years, often beginning with the least glamorous tasks imaginable: hemming, pressing, tacking, threading needles for someone more senior, learning to read a pattern before ever being trusted to cut fabric that actually cost money, because a single mistaken cut could ruin material a struggling household could not easily replace. Kelly came up through exactly that kind of unforgiving apprenticeship, learning a craft where the standard for success was binary and immediate. A garment either fit correctly or it did not, and there was no amount of charm or explanation that could talk a poorly finished seam into holding. The move to West Germany, when it eventually came, was less a single decisive leap than the natural next step for a young tradeswoman who had already proven herself capable of work most people twice her age would have struggled with. Service households attached to British diplomatic and military postings abroad recruited, throughout this period, from exactly the pool of skilled working-class women Kelly represented, offering wages that were modest by professional standards, but considerably better than anything comparable available at home. along with the less tangible appeal of travel, structure, and a working environment considerably more formal and hierarchical than anything Liverpool's dressmaking trade had prepared her for directly, even if the underlying discipline required was, in most of the ways that mattered, exactly the same. The household of the Governor of Gibraltar operated according to a rhythm that had almost nothing in common with civilian domestic service. Gibraltar in this period remained a British overseas territory of considerable strategic significance, its governor simultaneously a ceremonial figure representing the crown, and a working administrator overseeing genuine military and diplomatic responsibility, and the household surrounding that role functioned with a level of protocol closer to a small embassy than a large private house. Every visitor, every meal, every public appearance the governor's wife made carried a diplomatic dimension that an ordinary domestic employer's household simply did not have to consider, and Kelly, working inside that structure as a dressmaker attached to the household, absorbed an entire vocabulary of formal occasion, precedence, and the careful management of appearance under scrutiny, years before any of it would matter to a much larger and much more famous employer. The subsequent posting to a British military and diplomatic household in West Germany deepened that education considerably. This was still, in the period Kelly worked there, a Cold War posting in the fullest sense, part of a British military presence maintained continuously in West Germany from the end of the Second World War through to the fall of the Berlin Wall and beyond, a presence built around the assumption that the border a few hours' drive to the east represented a genuine and continuously monitored threat. Households attached to that presence, whether military or diplomatic, ran on a discipline shaped directly by that underlying seriousness. Security mattered in a way it rarely did in civilian life. Confidentiality was not a courtesy, it was closer to an operational requirement, because the wives and families of senior military and diplomatic personnel were themselves, in a limited but real sense, potential targets, or at minimum potential sources of information a hostile intelligence service might find useful. Kelly spent years working inside households where the assumption that some things simply never left the building was not a personality trait anyone had to teach her. It was the baseline condition of the job, absorbed the same way anyone absorbs the unstated rules of wherever they happen to work for long enough. It is worth being direct about how unusual this preparation turns out to look in retrospect, set against the far more conventional route most senior royal staff have traditionally taken. A private secretary typically arrives at the palace already fluent in the specific etiquette of court life, having attended the right schools, served in the right regiments, and absorbed, from childhood onward, an instinctive understanding of hierarchy and precedence that most people spend a lifetime never needing to learn. Kelly arrived from an almost entirely different direction, having learned discretion not from breeding, but from years inside disciplined institutions that happened to sit adjacent to power, rather than inside its traditional social class, and having learned exactness not from a finishing school, but from a dressmaking apprenticeship where a badly cut seam was simply a badly cut seam, regardless of who was wearing it. By the time she eventually returned to Britain and, not long afterward, joined the royal household in 1994, she brought with her a combination of skills that the traditional courtier pipeline had never been designed to produce, and that turned out, across the following 3 decades, to matter rather more than anyone at the time could reasonably have predicted. Precisely how Kelly came to the attention of the royal household in the first place is one of the details that has never been fully clarified in public reporting, and it deserves to be treated with the same caution as any other unverified specific in this account, rather than filled in with an invented origin story, simply because a clean narrative would read more satisfyingly. What the public record does support is the broad outline. She joined as a dresser in 1994, one appointment among several, within the wardrobe department, a tier of staff that existed well below the level of public visibility and operated, by design, almost entirely out of sight. New dressers in that era typically began with the most limited responsibilities available, caring for garments rather than choosing them, working under more senior staff who had themselves often spent decades inside the same department, learning the specific and largely unwritten conventions that governed every aspect of a royal wardrobe, from how a state gown was packed for travel, to which fabrics tolerated the particular demands of an outdoor engagement in unpredictable British weather. What changed Kelly's trajectory within that structure was not a single dramatic event, but an accumulation, over years, of small demonstrations of judgment that the Queen herself apparently noticed and increasingly relied upon. This is worth dwelling on because it runs directly against the popular assumption that royal favor arrives through some single memorable moment of connection, a witty remark, a perfectly timed piece of advice, the kind of scene a film adaptation would eventually dramatize. The actual mechanism, by every indication available, was far less cinematic and far more true to how trust actually gets built inside any long-term working relationship. Kelly was, apparently, reliably right about small things, repeatedly, across a period of years, and reliability compounds. A person who is right about a hemline once is useful. A person who has been right about 100 small judgment calls across a decade becomes, gradually and almost imperceptibly, someone whose opinion simply gets sought before a decision is made, rather than after. And that shift, more than any formal promotion, is where real influence inside an institution like this one actually originates. The formal title eventually attached to that accumulated trust, personal assistant, advisor, and curator to Her Majesty the Queen of Jewelry, Insignia, and Wardrobe, did not exist in that complete form from the beginning of Kelly's tenure. It developed in stages across the following years, each expansion of the title reflecting an expansion of responsibility that had, in most cases, already been happening informally for some time before the institution got around to writing it down. This lag between informal reality and formal acknowledgement is itself characteristic of how the household tends to operate. Authority is rarely granted in advance of trust. It is granted afterward, as a kind of retroactive ratification of an arrangement that has already proven itself to work, and the institution's own internal paperwork tends to catch up with reality only once the reality has become too obvious, or too useful, to leave unrecorded any longer. The curatorial dimension of that eventual title, the responsibility for jewelry and insignia, rather than simply wardrobe, deserves its own separate treatment, because it involved a category of decision considerably higher in stakes than clothing alone. The Crown's collection of jewelry carries historical, dynastic, and occasionally diplomatic weight that an outfit, however carefully chosen, rarely matches on its own. A tiara is never simply a tiara. Many of the pieces available for selection carry their own individual history, having belonged to a specific previous queen, having been worn at a specific previous coronation or wedding, having been gifted by a specific foreign government under specific historical circumstances that a poorly chosen repeat appearance could inadvertently reopen. Choosing which pieces to pair with which occasion required not merely an eye for what would photograph well, but a working knowledge of decades, sometimes centuries, of royal history, enough to avoid the kind of accidental symbolic misstep that a less informed advisor might walk directly into without realizing the significance of what they had just done. That Kelly was eventually trusted with this dimension of the role, not merely the practical mechanics of fabric and fit, but the far more historically loaded question of which specific historic jewels a reigning monarch should wear on which specific occasion, represents an extraordinary expansion of trust from where the job had originally begun, and it happened gradually enough that most outside observers only noticed it had happened once the full title finally made it into print. The Irish state visit of 2011 was not the only occasion where the colour doctrine carried diplomatic weight considerably heavier than its surface simplicity suggested, and a handful of other examples round out the picture usefully. The state visit of President Obama and the First Lady to Britain in 2011, arriving only weeks after the Irish visit, called for an entirely different visual register, warmer and more overtly celebratory, reflecting a relationship the palace had every institutional incentive to present as close and comfortable rather than historically fraught. The controversial state visit of President Trump in 2019 presented the opposite kind of challenge, an occasion where public opinion in Britain toward the visiting head of state was sharply divided, and where every visual choice made by the Queen risked being read, however unfairly, as an implicit political statement about a guest she was constitutionally obligated to receive, regardless of her own personal views on the matter, which she was, in any case, never permitted to make public. Kelly's task, on an occasion like that, was to produce a wardrobe correct enough in its formality and neutral enough in its symbolism that no commentator could plausibly claim the outfit itself was making a statement, an exercise in the deliberate avoidance of meaning, that is, paradoxically, its own considerable act of design skill. The 75th anniversary commemorations of VE Day, held in May of 2020, amid the earliest and strictest phase of the coronavirus pandemic, required yet another register entirely, one built around the practical constraints of an occasion that could not proceed in its traditional public form at all. The Queen's address to the nation that week, delivered from Windsor rather than from any grand public setting, needed to communicate solemnity, then a continuity with the wartime generation she herself had lived through as a young woman, and reassurance to a country confined to its homes, under conditions unlike anything the modern monarchy had ever had to address a population through before. The visual choices attached to that broadcast, considered against the enormous weight the moment carried, needed to get everything right, with essentially no margin for a second attempt, no crowd to read the room and adjust for, just a single camera, a single take, and an entire nation watching from isolation for some sign of steadiness at the top of the institution they were being asked to trust would see them through. Commonwealth tours across the decades added their own distinct vocabulary to the doctrine, one built around the specific and sometimes delicate diplomatic position each visited country occupied relative to Britain's colonial history. A visit to a Commonwealth nation with a comfortable, warm relationship to the Crown called for one kind of visual choice, incorporating local motifs or colours as a friendly gesture of respect. A visit to a nation where Republican sentiment ran higher, or where the colonial legacy remained a genuinely contested and painful subject, called for considerably more restraint, an outfit correct and dignified without ever appearing to claim ownership of local symbolism. The visit itself might already be straining to justify. Getting this balance wrong risked generating exactly the kind of unflattering headline the entire apparatus of royal wardrobe planning existed to prevent, a monarch appearing tone-deaf to the history her own presence inevitably invoked. Getting it right, which by all available evidence happened with remarkable consistency across Kelly's tenure, meant the visual dimension of these visits simply worked, invisibly, the way it was always designed to. A single ordinary working day, away from the concentrated pressure of a major state occasion, followed its own quieter rhythm, and that rhythm matters just as much to understanding the relationship as any of the more photographed moments do, arguably more, because it represents the overwhelming majority of the actual time the two women spent together across nearly 30 years. The Queen's own daily routine was, by multiple accounts across decades of royal reporting, remarkably consistent, structured around fixed points that changed very little, regardless of what else was happening in the world, and Kelly's own working day fit into that structure, at specific, predictable intervals, rather than existing as a constant presence throughout. Mornings involved decisions about the day's engagements, however modest, translated into practical wardrobe terms. Evenings, on the days when a formal function required it, involved a separate and more elaborate process entirely, one closer in spirit to preparing for a performance than preparing for an ordinary appointment, because formal evening occasions carried their own distinct visual expectations and their own distinct set of jewelry considerations layered on top of the clothing itself. What made this daily rhythm unusual compared to the working relationship most employers maintain with even trusted staff was the sheer duration and consistency of the physical proximity involved. Most senior courtiers, however close their working relationship with the sovereign, interacted with her in bounded, scheduled increments, a morning briefing, a weekly audience, structured meetings with a defined beginning and end. Kelly's work necessarily involved a different kind of contact, closer, more physical, and considerably less structured by the formal rhythms of state business, because clothing does not confine itself neatly to a scheduled appointment slot the way a policy briefing does. A hem that needed adjusting did not wait for a convenient gap in the diary. A jewelry choice that needed reconsidering an hour before an engagement required an immediate, unscheduled conversation, conducted quickly and without the layers of formal preparation that surrounded almost every other interaction the Queen had across an ordinary day. That kind of repeated, informal, physically close contact, sustained across decades, builds a specific texture of familiarity that the more formally bounded relationships around the sovereign simply could not replicate, however senior the person on the other side of them happened to be. It is this specific texture, more than any single dramatic anecdote, that explains why Kelly's account of laughter and genuine warmth reads as credible rather than as simple flattery dressed up for a memoir. Laughter tends to require repetition and familiarity more than it requires any single perfectly timed joke. A relationship built on hundreds of small, unscheduled, physically close interactions across 30 years develops its own private shorthand, its own accumulated stock of shared references and small running jokes that outsiders would never understand and insiders would never think to explain, because the explanation would take longer than the joke itself was ever worth. That kind of intimacy does not appear in a court circular. It does not photograph. It exists only in the accumulated texture of thousands of ordinary mornings, most of them entirely unremarkable, none of them individually significant enough to make it into any biography, and all of them, taken together, constituting exactly the kind of knowledge this piece has been arguing biographers can never fully reconstruct. The specific texture of institutional resentment, where it existed, tended to surface less in open confrontation than in the particular currency courtiers have always used against each other, careful, deniable insinuation, delivered to a friendly journalist under the protection of anonymity. Profiles of Kelly across the 2000s and 2010s occasionally carried a line or two, attributed to an unnamed household source, questioning whether a single individual should really hold quite so much informal sway over decisions that, in an earlier era, would have been distributed across several more senior and more traditionally credentialed members of staff. The complaint, stripped of its careful diplomatic phrasing, amounted to a fairly straightforward grievance about process. Decisions that used to require consultation across the Lord Chamberlain's office, the master of the household, and the wardrobe department's own established hierarchy increasingly seemed to run through a single conversation between the Queen and her dresser, a compression of the traditional decision-making chain that some longer-serving staff apparently found difficult to accept, regardless of how consistently good the resulting decisions turned out to be. There is a useful comparison to draw here with how large institutions generally respond to exactly this kind of compressed authority, because the pattern extends well beyond royal households into corporate structures, government departments, and any organization built around a formal hierarchy that a powerful individual's personal preference can effectively bypass. The people most threatened by that kind of compression are rarely the most senior figures in the traditional structure, who usually retain enough independent standing to absorb the change without much personal cost. The people most threatened tend to be the mid-level officials whose entire professional identity was built around being a necessary link in a chain that has just become, at least for certain kinds of decision, considerably shorter than it used to be. Several accounts across the years suggested exactly this dynamic playing out inside the household. Less a dramatic power struggle at the very top than a slow, grinding frustration among mid-level staff who found themselves increasingly bypassed on questions that had once, by tradition, required their sign-off. None of this friction, whatever its precise scale, appears to have meaningfully threatened Kelly's position at any point before the Queen's own death, and that durability is itself worth noting, because institutional resentment of exactly this kind has ended plenty of other careers considerably faster. What protected her, by every available account, was the same thing that had built her position in the first place: an employer whose trust in her judgment simply did not waver, regardless of how much quiet grumbling it apparently generated elsewhere in the building. An institution can absorb a great deal of internal friction around a single relationship, as long as the person at the very top of that institution keeps demonstrating, through consistent daily action, that the friction is not going to change anything. Queen Elizabeth II demonstrated exactly that, consistently, across nearly 30 years, and the demonstration itself, more than any formal statement of support, was probably the single most effective form of protection Kelly's position ever received. Widen the lens a little further, and the pattern connects to a much older and considerably darker history of how institutions of every kind have handled the women who performed the most intimate forms of physical care across the centuries. Royal and aristocratic wet nurses through much of European history lived inside a paradox that Kelly's own career, in a gentler and more consensual form, echoes fairly directly. A wet nurse was trusted with the literal physical survival of an infant heir, granted a degree of physical intimacy with a royal body that even the child's own mother sometimes did not match in the earliest months of life, and yet remained, in almost every documented case, entirely outside the formal structure of the household, paid, dismissed, and forgotten, according to a calendar that had nothing to do with the depth of the bond that had briefly existed. Norland-trained nannies, a tradition stretching from the late 19th century through to the present day, and still supplying senior childcare staff to prominent British families, including, in recent decades, the family of the Prince and Princess of Wales, occupy a strikingly similar position, trusted with the most intimate daily care of children who will one day hold enormous institutional significance, while remaining, by the deliberate design of the profession's own training culture, almost invisible in public discussion of the families they serve. The pattern across every one of these examples is consistent enough to count as something closer to a structural feature of how power arranges its most intimate labor than a coincidence repeated by chance across separate historical periods. The closer the physical intimacy required, the more thoroughly the institution has historically insisted on erasing the person providing it from the visible record, and Angela Kelly's brief, carefully managed visibility represents one of the very few genuine exceptions this centuries-old pattern has ever produced. Return for a moment to the specific mechanics of Prince Philip's funeral in April of 2021, because the pandemic conditions surrounding that day forced a set of decisions that had no real precedent anywhere in the modern history of royal mourning. Under the public health restrictions in force across Britain at that point, funeral attendance nationwide was limited to a small fixed number of guests, and the royal family, in a decision widely reported at the time as a deliberate act of solidarity with a grieving public living under identical restrictions, chose not to seek any special exemption. 30 mourners attended Prince Philip's funeral inside St. George's Chapel, a number that would have seemed almost unthinkably small for a service marking the death of a man who had stood beside the Queen for the entirety of her reign. And every one of those 30 places carried weight, both practical and symbolic, that an ordinary funeral's guest list simply does not have to bear. The image of the Queen sitting alone, on the far side of the chapel from where family would ordinarily have gathered close around her, became one of the defining photographs of the entire pandemic period in Britain, reproduced across front pages internationally as a kind of universal shorthand for the particular loneliness the pandemic had inflicted on grieving families everywhere, royal and otherwise. Getting the visual details of that single image right, in the sense of communicating dignity, restraint, and genuine private grief, without ever tipping into anything that could read as performance, required exactly the kind of judgment this piece has spent considerable time describing, judgment built from decades of understanding precisely how a single carefully composed detail reads once it reaches a camera lens 200 meters away, and then travels, within hours, to every newspaper on Earth. There was no opportunity to reshoot that photograph. There was no version of that day where a wardrobe misstep could be quietly corrected before the next available appearance. Every choice made that morning had to be right the first time, because the entire world was already watching, and would keep watching for as long as the image itself continued to circulate. The Platinum Jubilee, arriving barely 14 months later, carried an almost opposite emotional register, built around national celebration rather than private grief, and yet it demanded a comparable level of exacting care precisely because the underlying physical reality driving the Queen's limited participation was, by that point, impossible to fully disguise. 4 days of celebration had been planned across the calendar, and the Queen's actual public appearances across those 4 days amounted to a small handful of brief balcony moments, each one photographed exhaustively, each one scrutinized for any visible sign of the frailty that her absence from most of the scheduled events had already made impossible to ignore entirely. The challenge those brief appearances posed was, in a sense, the inverse of the funeral challenge a year earlier. Where the funeral required communicating dignified grief within a single unrepeatable image, the Jubilee balcony appearances required communicating continuity and quiet strength within a handful of very brief windows, each one needing to reassure a watching nation that the woman who had reigned for 70 years remained, in every way that actually mattered, still present, and still, however briefly, capable of the appearance the moment demanded. The Queen's own death in September of 2022, and the extraordinary period of national mourning that followed, occupies almost no space in Kelly's public story, and that absence deserves to be treated as meaningful rather than simply noted in passing. The choreography of those days, built around the long-prepared plan known as Operation London Bridge, involved an enormous cast of officials, courtiers, clergy, and household staff, each one performing a specific and carefully rehearsed role in a sequence that had been quietly refined for years in anticipation of exactly this moment. Kelly's name did not appear, in any significant way, across the extensive press coverage of those weeks, and that near-total absence from the public narrative of the Queen's own death is, in its own quiet way, entirely consistent with everything the rest of this piece has been arguing. The people whose work was most intimately bound up with the physical reality of the Queen's life, the people who had spent decades managing the parts of her existence that the public was never permitted to witness directly, were, by the same institutional logic that had kept that work invisible for 30 years, almost entirely absent from the visible story of her death as well. The silence held, right through to the very end, exactly the way it had been built to. The transition period following the Queen's death deserves considerably more detailed treatment than a single paragraph can offer, because the contrast between the preceding 3 decades and what reportedly followed is, in its own right, one of the more instructive parts of this entire story. King Charles III had, well before his accession, signalled a clear intention to reduce the overall scale and cost of the working monarchy, a modernizing instinct partly born of genuine conviction about the institution's future, and partly a pragmatic response to years of public and parliamentary scrutiny over royal spending. That broader agenda inevitably touched the household staff structure built up around his mother's decades in office, and reports across British newspapers in the months following the Queen's death described a series of departures, restructurings, and redundancies affecting long-serving members of the household, changes that in an earlier era might have unfolded gradually across years, but that the new king's stated priorities compressed into a considerably shorter and more visible timeframe. Kelly's position, built entirely on a personal bond with a specific individual sovereign rather than on any institutional office that survived a change of monarch, was always going to be among the most exposed to exactly this kind of restructuring, and reports from the period described precisely that outcome. The specific mechanics of her eventual departure from full-time royal service have been covered with less consistency across different outlets than the earlier, warmer years of her career, and some of that coverage has referenced a formal employment dispute during the period surrounding her exit, though the precise nature and resolution of any such dispute has not been established with the same clarity as the earlier, better documented parts of her career. What can be said with more confidence is the broader shape of the change. A working relationship built across nearly 30 years around one specific person's trust did not, and by its very nature could not, transfer automatically to a successor who had known Kelly only as a fixture of his mother's household, rather than as someone he had personally built the same accumulated decades of confidence with. The new king brought his own long-established staff, developed across his own decades as Prince of Wales, and the practical reality of institutional transition meant that Kelly's uniquely personal form of authority, however extraordinary it had once been, had very little natural place inside a fundamentally different working relationship, built around a fundamentally different person. There is a broader institutional lesson embedded in this transition that extends well past Kelly's individual case, one that applies, with only minor variation, to nearly every senior figure whose influence depended primarily on a personal bond with a specific reigning monarch, rather than on a formal office that persists across a change of sovereign. The British monarchy has weathered many such transitions across its history, and the pattern each time has been remarkably consistent. The people whose power derived from institutional office, the private secretary, the Lord Chamberlain, the established departments of the royal household, tend to survive a change of monarch with their positions relatively intact, because their authority was never really personal in the first place. It was institutional, attached to the role rather than to the individual occupying it at any given moment. The people whose power derived entirely from personal trust, however deep and however well earned across however many decades, tend to find that trust simply does not transfer, because it was never institutional to begin with, and an institution, however sentimental its public image, does not typically feel obligated to honor a bond it never itself created. Kelly's honors, accumulated across her decades of service and formally marking the institution's own acknowledgement of an unusual contribution, remain hers, regardless of how the transition ultimately unfolded, and they are worth returning to briefly as a final piece of the formal record. Appointment to the Royal Victorian Order, at whatever specific grade, exists as an honor system built entirely around personal service to the sovereign, rather than public office or national achievement. A category of recognition the institution reserves specifically for the people who worked closest to the monarch as an individual, rather than to the crown as an abstract institution. That Kelly received recognition through precisely this channel, repeatedly, across the decades of her service, stands as the closest thing to an official institutional statement about the true nature of her role that the record will likely ever produce. A formal acknowledgement, however dry and however minimal, that the relationship at the center of this entire account was never really about wardrobe management at all, however precisely that phrase continued to appear on her official title right up until the end. The curatorial half of Kelly's title connects her work to a considerably older and more formally established institutional apparatus than the wardrobe side of the job might initially suggest, namely the Royal Collection Trust, the charitable body responsible for the care, conservation, and public presentation of the vast art and heritage collection held in trust for the nation by the reigning monarch. Professional curators working within that institution operate according to museum standards, recognizable to any conservator anywhere in the world: careful documentation, controlled environmental conditions for storage, formal condition reports before and after any object leaves secure storage for public display. Kelly's curatorial responsibility for jewelry and insignia sat in an unusual and genuinely distinctive position relative to that more conventional museum apparatus, because the objects under her care were not, for the most part, sitting quietly in a display case behind reinforced glass. They were, on a regular and frequent basis, removed from secure storage and worn, in public, by a living head of state, exposed to weather, movement, and the ordinary physical risks of an active life, in a way that almost no other comparably valuable historic jewelry collection anywhere in the world is ever asked to endure. That distinction matters more than it might initially appear to, because it means Kelly's curatorial judgment had to operate simultaneously across two entirely different registers that most professional curators never have to reconcile within a single decision. She needed the conservator's caution, an understanding of exactly how much physical stress a 200-year-old setting could safely tolerate before risking damage that no amount of institutional wealth could ever fully undo, because some historic craftsmanship, once lost, simply cannot be recreated by any modern jeweler working from photographs and written descriptions alone. She also needed the entirely different judgment of a working stylist, choosing pieces for immediate visual impact under specific lighting and specific camera conditions, on a strict deadline that a museum conservator planning a permanent exhibition installation would never have to work within. Very few people anywhere in the world have ever needed to hold both of those skill sets simultaneously, at the level of consequence Kelly's position demanded, for the simple reason that almost no other historic jewelry collection of comparable significance is ever actually worn, rather than merely displayed. Specific individual pieces carried their own accumulated weight that made each selection decision considerably more loaded than an outside observer glancing at a photograph would likely appreciate. Tiaras handed down through multiple generations of the royal family, several of them originally created for or worn by earlier queens going back well over a century, each carried an implicit genealogical statement whenever they reappeared in public, a visual reminder of continuity stretching back through reigns the current sovereign herself had only read about in the same history books available to everyone else. Brooches with specific diplomatic or Commonwealth associations, gifted by specific nations on specific historic occasions, carried their own risk of unintended meaning if worn at the wrong moment, or, just as easily, their own opportunity for a small but meaningful gesture of respect, if worn at precisely the right one. Getting these choices right required a working knowledge of royal and Commonwealth history considerably deeper than most people outside the household would ever have reason to develop, and Kelly, by every available account, developed exactly that knowledge across her decades in the role, becoming, in the process, something closer to an informal historian of the Crown's own physical heritage than her official job title, focused so heavily on the practical language of wardrobe and insignia, ever fully captured. Media fascination with the relationship between the Queen and her dresser built steadily across the 2000s and accelerated considerably after the publication of the two books. And it is worth examining why a working relationship built almost entirely around clothing and jewelry generated quite so much sustained public curiosity across so many years. Part of the answer is simply that royal reporting, across the entire modern history of the British press, has always struggled to find genuinely new material about a family whose formal public appearances follow such a tightly scripted and repetitive rhythm. A state opening of Parliament looks, in its broad outlines, much like every previous state opening of Parliament. A garden party photographs, much like every previous garden party. Reporters and editors alike are perpetually hungry for any detail that offers a genuinely fresh angle on an institution otherwise defined by careful, deliberate repetition, and Kelly's story offered exactly that. A working-class woman from an unglamorous corner of Liverpool, wielding more informal daily influence over the sovereign's public presentation than most senior aristocrats in the country would ever manage. That contrast wrote its own headlines almost automatically, requiring very little embellishment from the journalists covering it. The deeper appeal, though, ran past simple novelty into something closer to genuine public curiosity about intimacy itself, about what it might actually feel like to be trusted, completely and without reservation, by one of the most guarded and carefully managed public figures on earth. Most people encounter the monarchy only through its most formal and distant register: a wave from a balcony, a scripted Christmas broadcast, a brief handshake at a public event lasting perhaps 4 or 5 seconds. The idea that a single individual, and specifically an individual who had started life with no advantages of birth or education that would traditionally have opened such a door, had access to a version of the Queen that laughed, teased, and spoke candidly, rather than carefully, held an almost fairy tale appeal that transcended ordinary royal reporting's usual preoccupation with scandal, wealth, and ceremony. Kelly's story offered warmth in an institution most commonly covered through the lens of formality or crisis, and warmth, it turns out, sells newspapers just as reliably as scandal does, if considerably less often, because genuine warmth inside this particular institution has always been considerably rarer material to find. That sustained curiosity produced, across the years, a modest body of broadcast material featuring Kelly directly, interviews and behind-the-scenes segments that offered brief, carefully managed glimpses of the working relationship in her own words, rather than filtered entirely through a journalist's paraphrase. These appearances were, consistent with everything else in this account, tightly controlled and sparing in what they actually revealed. Granted, at moments the palace communications operation judged useful and withheld at all other times, but they nonetheless represented a genuinely unusual level of direct public access to a senior member of the working household, a level of access almost never extended to private secretaries, equerries, or any of the more traditionally credentialed staff occupying formally superior positions in the household hierarchy. The willingness to grant that access to Kelly specifically, while withholding it almost entirely from staff occupying considerably higher formal rank, offers one more small but telling data point, confirming just how far outside the conventional hierarchy her actual position had grown. It is worth returning, with a slightly wider historical lens, to the question of why domestic and personal service work has been gendered so consistently across the entire history of great households, royal and otherwise. Because the pattern is not incidental to Kelly's story, it is close to the entire structural explanation for why her career reads as unusual in the first place. The most senior, most publicly visible, and most institutionally powerful roles inside a traditional household, the private secretary, the equerry, the comptroller, were, for most of the monarchy's modern history, filled almost exclusively by men, drawn from a narrow pool of acceptable social backgrounds, military service, the law, the established professions considered appropriate for a gentleman. The roles involving the most direct physical intimacy with the sovereign's actual body, dressing, personal care, the daily management of appearance, were, with almost equal consistency, filled by women, and the women filling those roles were drawn overwhelmingly from working or lower middle-class backgrounds, precisely because this kind of physically intimate service work has, across most of British history, been culturally coded as domestic labour rather than professional expertise, regardless of how much genuine skill it actually required. That coding carried real institutional consequences that outlasted the specific historical periods that first produced it. Domestic labour, however skilled, has historically been paid less, credited less, and remembered less than the kind of paper-based, intellectual labour performed by private secretaries and equerries, even in cases where the actual skill and judgment required were entirely comparable, and in some cases considerably more demanding, given the narrower margin for visible error a wardrobe choice carries, compared to a private memorandum nobody outside the building will ever read. The entire framework this piece has been building around Angela Kelly, the idea that she possessed knowledge no biographer could access, only makes sense once you understand that this gendered undervaluing of domestic and personal service labour is precisely why nobody thought to record that knowledge properly in the first place. Nobody commissioned an oral history project documenting the working lives of royal dressers across the 20th century, the way historians eventually did for private secretaries and equerries, because domestic service, however central to a household's actual daily functioning, has rarely been treated by historians, or by the institutions themselves, as a category of work worth systematically preserving. Kelly's partial exception to this pattern, however carefully managed and however incomplete, matters for reasons that extend past her individual case into a broader question about whether the culture around royal service is changing in any lasting way. The younger generation of working royals, particularly the household built up around the Prince and Princess of Wales, has shown some evidence of a somewhat different approach to staff visibility, still cautious and still tightly managed by any ordinary corporate standard, but marginally more willing to acknowledge, in limited and controlled ways, the individual contributions of specific staff members rather than maintaining the near-total institutional anonymity that defined most of the 20th century. Whether this represents a genuine, lasting cultural shift or simply a more sophisticated evolution of the same underlying media management instinct that eventually authorized Kelly's own books, remains an open question that only the coming decades will actually answer. What can be said with more confidence is that Kelly's own career, whatever its ultimate motivations on the institution's side, established a template, a working example that a member of household staff, drawn from an unconventional background, could rise to genuine influence and could, eventually and with permission, speak publicly about that influence, without the kind of total professional destruction Paul Burrell experienced for attempting something considerably less extensive without the same institutional blessing. There is a particular kind of urgency worth naming directly in how this piece has approached its own central claim, because the knowledge this account keeps insisting no biographer will ever fully capture is not simply lost to time in the ordinary way that all unrecorded history eventually fades. It exists, right now, inside the memory of a single living woman who has spent nearly 30 years demonstrating an almost total commitment to discretion, and who has given no public indication that this commitment has weakened now that the specific individual it protected is no longer alive to enforce it. Oral historians who work with elderly witnesses to significant events understand this urgency intimately, the awareness that a particular category of first-hand knowledge exists only as long as the person who holds it continues to exist, and that once that person is gone, the knowledge does not transfer to any archive, any successor, any institution. It simply ends. Angela Kelly, at the time of this account, remains alive and in possession of decades of exactly this kind of irreplaceable first-hand knowledge, and whether any further portion of it ever reaches the public record depends entirely on choices she alone will make, choices that nothing in her 3 decades of demonstrated discretion suggests she is likely to make quickly or lightly. It is worth taking the skeptical case seriously one more time, because a fair account owes its subject at least one more round of genuine scrutiny before reaching a final verdict, and the most serious version of the skeptical argument goes beyond simple cynicism about palace public relations into a more substantive question about whether this entire account has overstated Kelly's actual significance relative to the many other people who also worked closely with the Queen across her 70-year reign. Private secretaries managed constitutional crises with consequences for the entire nation. Equerries coordinated the practical logistics of a working life spanning decades and dozens of countries. Personal protection officers carried responsibility for the Queen's literal physical safety, a category of trust arguably even more fundamental than the trust involved in dressing her. Measured against contributions of that scale and consequence, the skeptical argument runs: elevating a dresser to the center of a piece about unique insider knowledge risks mistaking proximity for importance, confusing physical closeness with genuine significance to the institution's actual functioning. That argument deserves a direct response rather than a dismissal, and the response is this. The claim this piece has been making was never that Kelly's contribution outweighed the constitutional significance of a private secretary's work, or the literal life and death stakes of a protection officer's responsibility. The claim was narrower and, in its own way, more specific. It was that the particular category of knowledge Kelly accumulated, the daily physical texture of an aging, increasingly frail body being maintained in a state of public composure across decades, is a category no other role in the entire household ever had comparable access to, and a category no biographer working from the paper record those other roles actually generate could ever hope to reconstruct with the same completeness. A private secretary's memoranda survive, however incomplete, in an archive somewhere, eventually accessible to a determined historian with the right clearances and enough patience. A protection officer's incident reports, however heavily redacted, exist in some institutional file. Kelly's knowledge exists nowhere except inside her own memory, precisely because the nature of the work itself never generated the kind of paper trail every other significant role in the household generates almost automatically, as a byproduct of simply doing the job. That distinction, not a claim about overall institutional importance, is what makes her story genuinely different in kind from every other insider account this entire genre of Royal History Channel typically covers. Widen the comparison one final time, beyond the British monarchy specifically, and the same underlying structural pattern reappears across essentially every European royal court, still functioning into the modern era, suggesting this is not a quirk peculiar to one institution, but something closer to a universal feature of how monarchies, regardless of nationality, have always organized the labor surrounding a sovereign's physical presentation. Other reigning European houses have maintained broadly comparable roles across the same decades: dressers, personal attendants, and household staff, trusted with exactly the same category of intimate physical knowledge, and the same pattern of institutional silence surrounding those roles holds with remarkable consistency across national boundaries and across very different court cultures. Whatever the specific language, whatever the specific formal title attached to the position in any given country's household structure, the underlying arrangement remains essentially identical: a person trusted with the most physically intimate dimension of a public figure's life, operating almost entirely outside the institution's own formal channels of recorded authority, and expected, as an unstated but universally understood condition of the job, to carry the resulting knowledge to their grave. Angela Kelly's partial, carefully managed exception to that universal pattern is worth remembering, as genuinely rare, not merely within the specific history of the British royal household, but within the entire multinational tradition of monarchical service this comparison reveals. Consider, too, how this pattern of institutional silence extends past dressers, specifically into essentially every category of staff whose work brings them into the kind of sustained physical proximity that generates knowledge no formal record could ever capture. Chauffeurs who have driven the same senior figure for decades accumulate an intimate understanding of mood, health, and private conversation that no biographer interviewing them years later, bound by the same confidentiality culture that shaped their entire career, will ever fully access. Personal chefs who have cooked for a household across decades develop an intimate understanding of appetite, health, and daily rhythm that speaks volumes about a person's actual physical condition on any given day. Knowledge that similarly disappears into professional silence rather than surfacing in any accessible record. Housekeepers who have managed private apartments across decades understand routines, habits, and small private preferences that never once appear in any official document, because documenting them was never the point of the job, discretion was. Every one of these roles, taken together, constitutes an enormous, largely invisible archive of first-hand knowledge about how the most carefully documented public figures in modern British history actually lived their unguarded, ordinary days. An archive that exists almost entirely in living memory, is shrinking with every year that passes, and will very likely disappear almost entirely within the lifetimes of the people who currently hold it, most of whom will take the same disciplined silence to their graves that has defined this entire category of service for centuries. Angela Kelly's specific position within that much larger, largely unrecorded population is unusual only in the degree, not the kind, of proximity involved, and that degree is worth stating plainly one final time before this account moves toward its conclusion. Across nearly 30 years, she was present, in a physically close and functionally necessary capacity, for essentially every significant public appearance a reigning British monarch made, across a period covering some of the most consequential moments in the modern history of the institution, the death of a princess and the crisis of public confidence that followed it. The choreographed pageantry of 2 royal jubilees, the pandemic that forced an entire nation, monarch included, into an isolation without precedent in living memory, the death of a husband after 73 years of marriage, and finally, the slow, carefully managed physical decline that preceded the sovereign's own death. No other single individual, with the possible exception of the immediate royal family itself, occupied a comparable position of sustained physical proximity across that entire span, and no other individual in that position has ever been granted, by the sovereign herself, quite as much latitude to speak, however carefully and however incompletely, about what that proximity actually involved. It would be a mistake, in fact, to treat Kelly's position as a complete anomaly within the Queen's own management style, because the pattern of quietly elevating a small number of unconventional, deeply trusted individuals into positions of genuine informal influence recurs, in smaller and less publicized ways, across the entire 70-year reign. Her long-serving racing manager, brought into her confidence over decades through a shared passion for thoroughbred breeding that had nothing to do with constitutional duty and everything to do with genuine personal interest, occupied a not entirely dissimilar position, an expert in a specialized field, granted access and influence that had little to do with traditional court hierarchy and everything to do with the Queen's own direct, personal judgment of competence and character. Her senior page, a role responsible for the practical daily logistics of royal life at the most intimate level, similarly built, across years of proximity, a kind of trust that outranked considerably more senior officials on the specific narrow questions that fell within his actual domain of expertise. The common thread running through every one of these relationships is a pattern worth naming plainly. Queen Elizabeth II, across the entire length of her reign, showed a consistent and apparently deliberate preference for trusting demonstrated competence over inherited credential, in a small number of carefully chosen relationships that existed somewhat outside the institution's own formal hierarchy, even as the institution around her continued to run, in most other respects, according to precisely the traditional, credential-based system those relationships quietly bypassed. This pattern matters for understanding Kelly's story correctly, because it complicates any reading of her career as a single, isolated exception to an otherwise rigidly traditional institution. It was not isolated. It was, instead, one particularly visible and eventually well-documented example of a management style the Queen appears to have practiced, in smaller and less publicized ways, across her entire working life, extending genuine trust and genuine informal authority to a select handful of individuals whose value she had personally verified through years of direct observation, regardless of what their background, education, or formal position within the household happened to suggest about how much authority they were technically entitled to hold. Kelly's version of this pattern simply became, over time, by far the most visible and the most publicly documented example, both because the specific nature of her work brought her into daily public view alongside the Queen in a way that a racing manager's expertise rarely required, and because the eventual authorization of her books gave the wider public a level of direct insight into the relationship that none of the Queen's other similarly unconventional trusted relationships ever received. The early years of Kelly's tenure, before any of this later trust had accumulated, deserve one further moment of attention, because the gap between where she started and where she eventually arrived is easy to lose sight of once the story has been told in full. A newly appointed dresser in 1994 occupied one of the most junior positions available within the wardrobe department's own internal hierarchy, working under considerably more senior staff who had themselves often spent decades inside the same department and who guarded the accumulated institutional knowledge of that role, quite understandably, as their own hard-earned professional territory. Kelly's early years would have involved learning that territory from the ground up, absorbing decades of accumulated convention about fabric care, travel logistics, and the precise unwritten protocols governing every aspect of a royal wardrobe, largely by watching, listening, and demonstrating, through consistent, competent execution of unglamorous tasks, that she could be trusted with progressively greater responsibility. Nothing about her eventual position was handed to her on arrival. It was built methodically across years, from the most junior possible starting point, a detail that tends to disappear once a career is summarized in the compressed language of a formal title, but one worth restoring here, because it is the part of the story that actually explains how a docker's daughter from Anfield ended up, 3 decades later, holding more informal daily influence over a reigning monarch's public presentation than almost anyone else in the entire building. Return, with considerably more depth than the earlier passing mention allowed, to the Olympic opening ceremony sequence of 2012, because the mechanics behind that single short film illustrate almost everything this piece has been arguing about: trust, judgment, and the specific kind of knowledge required to manage a monarch's public image at the highest level of risk. The sequence required secrecy of a kind almost unheard of for any project involving the sovereign directly, filmed in genuine confidence months before the ceremony itself, with the small number of people involved in production and planning bound to silence under conditions considerably stricter than an ordinary royal engagement would ever require, because the entire creative value of the sequence depended entirely on the element of surprise surviving intact until the moment it aired live in front of a global television audience numbering in the hundreds of millions. A single leak, at any point in the months of planning that preceded the ceremony, would have destroyed the sequence's impact entirely, and very possibly exposed the Queen to exactly the kind of ridicule her advisors had spent decades working to prevent. A monarch persuaded into an undignified stunt by an overeager television producer, rather than a monarch making a confident, self-assured choice about her own participation in a moment of genuine national celebration. The judgment required to advise the Queen toward participation, rather than away from it, deserves recognition as a genuinely significant act of risk assessment, because the downside of getting this particular call wrong was considerably larger than the downside of a poorly chosen hemline. A misjudged sense of humor, played out on the largest possible stage in front of the largest possible audience, risked doing lasting damage to decades of carefully cultivated institutional dignity, the kind of damage that a single bad headline about a hemline simply could not match in scale. The people around the Queen who ultimately supported her decision to participate, including by every reasonable inference the same trusted circle this piece has been describing throughout, were betting an enormous amount of accumulated institutional capital on their own collective judgment that this particular gamble would land exactly as intended. It did. The sequence became, almost immediately, one of the most celebrated pieces of royal media in the entire history of television. Praised across the political spectrum, referenced constantly in the years since as a defining example of the institution's ability to be genuinely funny without ever compromising its underlying dignity, and the confidence required to greenlight that gamble in the first place rested entirely on people who had spent years learning, through the accumulated evidence of 1,000 smaller decisions, exactly how far the Queen's own instincts could be trusted. The origin of the phrase that eventually became something close to shorthand for the entire color visibility doctrine the idea that she needed to be seen to be believed, has been repeated across so many profiles and so many years that its precise original context has become difficult to trace with total certainty, and it should be treated, in this account as in any careful one, as a widely reported formulation rather than a verified verbatim transcript of a specific private conversation. What can be said with confidence is that the underlying principle it captures, color as functional visibility rather than mere aesthetic preference, shaped visible, documented, photographable decisions across decades of public appearances in a way that anyone who has studied the pattern of the Queen's public wardrobe across her later reign can verify simply by looking at the record itself, regardless of the precise wording anyone eventually used to explain the logic behind it. There is one further comparison worth drawing before this account moves toward its close, and it comes from within the same royal family rather than from a different institution entirely, because it demonstrates the same underlying pattern playing out with even sharper public consequences, a full generation before Kelly's own story unfolded. William Talon, widely known by the affectionate nickname Backstairs Billy, served as page to the Queen Mother for more than 50 years, rising to become one of the most trusted and most constantly present figures in her entire household, close enough to earn a grace and favour cottage within the grounds of Clarence House, and close enough, by every account from the period, to have become something considerably closer to family than to staff in the ordinary sense of the word. The Queen Mother's own affection for him was, by all reports, genuine, deep, and sustained across 5 decades of daily proximity, a relationship that in its broad emotional shape bears an obvious resemblance to the one this piece has spent so much time describing between Kelly and the Queen herself. What happened after the Queen Mother's death in 2002 offers a considerably starker and more publicly visible version of the same institutional lesson this piece has already drawn from Kelly's own transition following 2022. Talon's position, built entirely around one specific individual's personal affection, did not survive her death in anything like its previous form, and reports at the time described a difficult and publicly contested process surrounding his eventual departure from the grace and favour accommodation he had occupied for decades, a dispute that generated considerable sympathetic press coverage at the time, much of it framing the situation as a stark illustration of exactly how quickly institutional gratitude can evaporate once the specific person who felt it is no longer alive to insist on its continuation. The parallel to Kelly's own considerably more discreetly handled transition 2 decades later is not exact in every particular, and the two situations differed in important ways, but the underlying structural lesson is close to identical in both cases. Personal loyalty, however deep, however publicly celebrated while the relationship that created it still lives, has never once, across the entire modern history of this institution, proven durable enough to survive the death of the specific individual who granted it, and both Talon's more publicly turbulent experience and Kelly's more quietly managed one confirm the same underlying rule from 2 very different angles, separated by exactly 20 years. The title Kelly chose for her 2019 book, The Other Side of the Coin, rewards a closer reading than it usually receives, because the phrase itself carries a double meaning that seems, on reflection, entirely deliberate. On the most obvious level, it promised readers a genuinely different perspective on a public figure whose image had, by that point, been examined from nearly every conceivable angle across 7 decades of relentless media coverage. The other side, quite literally, of a face that had appeared on every coin minted in the country for the entirety of most living readers' lives. On a subtler level, though, the phrase also acknowledged, whether consciously or not, the fundamental limitation built into the book's own project. A coin has exactly 2 sides, and seeing one does not mean you have seen the whole object, let alone understood everything about the metal, the minting process, or the decisions that produced the specific design pressed into the surface. Kelly's book offered readers the other side of a coin they had spent decades looking at from only one angle, and that offer was genuinely valuable, genuinely unprecedented in its access, and still, by its own implicit logic, only ever one additional side of an object that remains, in its fullest depth, considerably more complex than any 2-sided view could ever fully capture. Reviews and reader reception of the book across its publication in 2019 tended to focus, understandably, on exactly the material that made it newsworthy in the first place. The practical mechanics of the working relationship, the color theory, the trust, the genuine warmth that came through in Kelly's own recollections, and considerably less critical attention was paid, at the time, to what the book deliberately withheld, a gap this account has already spent considerable time examining directly. That imbalance in the original reception is itself worth noting, because it illustrates how effectively the book achieved exactly what an authorized royal memoir is designed to achieve, generating genuine public interest and genuine warmth toward the institution through carefully controlled disclosure, without inviting the kind of closer scrutiny that might have asked harder questions about everything the narrative had chosen not to include. It is worth closing this particular thread with one final observation about the physical texture of the fitting process itself, described here in general terms consistent with how any royal dresser's daily work has been described across multiple decades of household reporting, rather than as any specific reconstructed scene from Kelly's own particular practice. A fitting session for any significant public appearance typically unfolded in careful, unhurried stages, garments checked against the specific practical demands of the day ahead, movement tested, hemlines assessed not merely for appearance, but for how they would behave in wind or in the specific choreography a given engagement required. Standing, sitting, the particular geometry of entering and exiting a vehicle, without ever appearing rushed or undignified in the process. The entire exercise operated according to a standard that had almost nothing to do with how a garment might read in a still photograph, taken under studio conditions, and everything to do with how it would actually perform, in real time, in unpredictable weather, under sustained public observation, for however many hours the day's schedule required. That distinction between clothing designed to be photographed once and clothing designed to be lived in publicly for an entire demanding day sits at the very center of what made this particular kind of expertise so specialized and so far removed from anything the ordinary language of fashion or styling ever fully prepared outside observers to understand. Consider, finally, before this account turns toward its closing synthesis, what the entire arc of Kelly's career suggests about the relationship between visibility and value inside an institution built almost entirely around the careful management of appearance. The single most valuable thing Kelly ever produced, across nearly 30 years of demanding, highly skilled labor, was the absence of a mistake, the total invisibility of the enormous effort required to make an aging, increasingly frail monarch look, in every single public appearance, exactly as composed and unremarkable as she had looked 30 years earlier. Success, in this specific line of work, is defined entirely by what an observer does not notice. Nobody remembers a hemline that behaved correctly. Nobody writes a headline about a jewelry choice that carried no unintended diplomatic weight. The entire measure of professional excellence in this field is the complete absence of anything worth commenting on, and that inverted relationship between skill and visibility explains, more thoroughly than any single anecdote could, why this category of labor has always been so thoroughly undervalued by institutions and historians alike. The work that succeeds completely leaves no trace at all, while the work that fails, even once, in even one small visible way, generates headlines that circulate for decades. An institution built on exactly that asymmetry will always struggle to properly credit the people whose greatest achievement is a kind of perfect, permanent silence. This asymmetry connects back, one final time, to the central comparison this piece opened with, between the paper-based discretion of a figure like Tommy Lascelles and the physical discretion practiced by Angela Kelly across her own 3 decades of service. Lascelles left behind diaries, eventually published, that historians continue to mine for insight into the private workings of the mid-century monarchy, a paper trail that, however carefully curated during his own lifetime, nonetheless survived him and continues to shape how his contribution to the institution gets remembered and assessed. Kelly's authorized book represents her own, considerably more limited version of the same impulse, a decision to leave something behind, rather than let the entire relationship disappear into the same total silence that swallowed the working lives of every royal dresser who came before her, across centuries of largely unrecorded service. That decision, modest as its actual content ultimately proved to be, stands as a genuinely significant act within the specific history this piece has been tracing. The first meaningful crack in a wall of institutional silence that had otherwise held, without serious challenge, for the entire multi-century history of this particular kind of intimate royal service. Whether that crack widens further, whether Kelly herself ever chooses to say more than the careful, palace-approved version already in print, or whether the silence simply closes back over what remains of her first-hand knowledge, the way it has closed over every comparable figure before her, is a question this account cannot answer, because the answer belongs entirely to a woman who has spent 3 decades demonstrating, through consistent daily action, rather than any public statement, exactly how seriously she takes the discretion her position always demanded. What can be said, with confidence, is that the knowledge itself is real, that it is genuinely unlike anything any conventional biography of Queen Elizabeth II has ever managed to capture, and that its existence, whether it ever surfaces further or not, stands as a permanent, if largely invisible, correction to every account of this reign that has ever claimed to tell the complete story. Set Kelly's visibility against the almost complete historical blankness surrounding the dressers who served earlier queens, and the scale of what her career actually represents becomes considerably clearer. Queen Victoria's own dressers across her 63-year reign are, for the most part, names known only to specialist historians who have gone digging through household account books and staff registers, rather than any wider public memory. Individuals who spent years or decades in close physical proximity to one of the most documented monarchs in British history, and who left behind, collectively, barely a handful of paragraphs across the entire subsequent literature on her reign. Queen Mary, famously private and famously precise about her own appearance and her considerable jewelry collection, relied on dressers whose names barely survive even in specialist royal history circles, let alone in any form of wider public recognition. The Queen Mother, across her own remarkably long life in the public eye, depended on personal maids and dressers whose contribution to her carefully cultivated public image went almost entirely unacknowledged in her own lifetime, and remains, even now, considerably less documented than the parallel contribution William Talon made in his more visible role as her page. Against that centuries-deep pattern of almost total historical erasure, Kelly's authorized books, her occasional broadcast appearances, and the honors she received across her decades of service represent a genuinely significant break from precedent, however carefully managed that break ultimately proved to be. She is very likely the single most publicly documented royal dresser in the entire recorded history of the British monarchy, a distinction that says less about the objective scale of her individual contribution relative to her predecessors, who very likely performed comparably skilled and comparably demanding work across their own careers, and considerably more about the specific, unrepeatable combination of circumstances that made her visibility possible, a media environment finally hungry enough for exactly this kind of human interest material, a sovereign personally willing to authorize an unprecedented level of disclosure, and a working relationship that happened to last long enough and prove durable enough to generate the kind of sustained public interest that a shorter or less remarkable tenure would never have accumulated. It is worth applying one final, honest corrective before this account moves toward its close, because not every claim that has circulated in press coverage of Kelly across the years deserves to be repeated with the same confidence as the more thoroughly documented facts this piece has relied upon. Tabloid coverage, across any subject, tends toward exaggeration, and Kelly's story, precisely because it offered such rich material for a compelling narrative, attracted its own share of embellishment over the years. Claims about her influence, her wealth, her specific private conversations with the Queen, that circulated widely enough to become something close to accepted fact in less careful accounts, without ever being verified by anyone in a position to actually confirm them. A responsible account of this story owes its subject the same discipline it has been asking of the reader throughout, distinguishing carefully between what multiple credible sources have consistently confirmed, the broad shape of her career, the authorized books, the honors, the documented public role in specific major occasions, and what remains, however widely repeated, essentially unverified color dressed up as settled fact. This piece has tried to hold that line throughout, and it is worth stating plainly, one final time, that some of the more colorful details attached to Kelly's legend over the years belong in the second category rather than the first, regardless of how often they have been repeated. There is a final structural point worth making about how this entire account has been assembled, because it bears directly on the honesty of the claim at its center. Every specific factual detail in this piece, the dates, the titles, the book publications, the honors, the broad shape of the Germany years, and the 1994 appointment, comes from the public record, from profiles, official statements, and the authorized material Kelly herself chose to release. None of it comes from any invented scene, any imagined dialogue, any reconstructed private conversation, presented as though it had been directly witnessed. The entire argument this piece has been making, that a category of knowledge exists which the public record cannot capture, is not an invitation to fill that gap with invention. It is, instead, an argument for a specific kind of intellectual honesty about the limits of what any account, however thorough, can actually claim to know. The most tempting move available to any storyteller working with a subject like this one would be to manufacture the missing texture, to imagine a specific overheard remark, a specific private moment of grief or laughter, and present it with the same confidence as the verified facts surrounding it. This account has deliberately declined that temptation throughout, because doing otherwise would have meant becoming exactly the kind of unreliable, embellished source this piece has spent considerable time warning against, adding one more layer of unverified color to a legend that has already accumulated more of that color than the verified record can actually support. That discipline matters for a reason beyond simple journalistic caution, because it connects directly back to the entire thesis this piece has been built around. If a biographer, or a documentary account like this one, cannot verify the specific texture of what Kelly witnessed across 3 decades, and declines to invent it, rather than pretend to knowledge nobody outside her own memory actually possesses, that restraint is itself the clearest possible demonstration of the argument at the center of this entire piece. The knowledge genuinely is inaccessible from the outside. It cannot be reconstructed from documents, because the documents were never created. It cannot be reliably inferred from testimony, because the testimony that exists is itself carefully limited by the same discretion that shaped the original working relationship. The honest position, the only intellectually defensible position available to anyone examining this story from the outside, is to describe clearly what is known, to name plainly what remains genuinely unknown, and to resist the pull toward filling that gap with confident-sounding invention, simply because invention would make for a more satisfying story. That resistance is, in its own modest way, an echo of the exact discipline this piece has spent its entire length describing in Angela Kelly herself. The discipline of knowing precisely where the line sits between what can honestly be said and what must, out of genuine respect for the truth, remain unsaid. There is a wider lesson here about the entire profession of biography itself, one that extends well past the specific case this piece has been examining and applies to essentially every biographical account ever written about any figure whose public role depended on people working closest to their actual daily life. Biography, as a form, has always carried an implicit promise it can never entirely fulfill, the promise of a complete life rendered on the page, when the actual raw material available to any biographer, however diligent, has always been partial, filtered, and shaped by exactly the same discretion this piece has spent its length describing. Every significant public figure in history has been surrounded by a circle of people considerably closer to their daily physical reality than any biographer could ever hope to become, and the vast majority of those people, across the entire history of biography as a discipline, took what they knew to their graves without ever publishing a word of it, for reasons ranging from simple professional discretion to genuine affection for the person they had served, to straightforward fear of the consequences that breaking silence might bring. Biographers have always worked, whether they acknowledge it openly or not, with an incomplete record, filling the gaps with careful inference, educated speculation, and the confident-sounding prose the genre traditionally demands, prose that can make an incomplete picture read as though it were considerably more complete than the underlying evidence actually supports. Angela Kelly's story simply makes this ordinary, usually invisible limitation of the biographical form unusually visible, because her position, and the specific glimpse into it that her authorized books eventually provided, offers a rare, concrete example of exactly how much a conventional biography, built from documents and distant interviews, would have missed entirely, had it not been for one specific woman's decision, granted one specific instance of institutional permission, to say even the modest amount she eventually said. Every biography of Queen Elizabeth II published before Kelly's own books, and most published since, necessarily worked without this material, constructing their portrait of the monarch's daily life from the outside, from public appearances, from the recollections of officials who saw her across a desk, rather than across a fitting room mirror, from the necessarily distant vantage point that has always been the biographer's ordinary working condition. Those biographies are not wrong, exactly. They are simply, structurally, incomplete in a way their own careful scholarly apparatus, however impressive, could never fully disclose to a reader who had no independent way of knowing what had been left out. That incompleteness will very likely outlast every specific detail this piece has managed to gather, because the underlying condition it describes is structural rather than incidental, built into the very nature of biography as a form rather than into any particular failure of research or diligence on any individual biographer's part. Future accounts of Queen Elizabeth II, written by scholars with access to archives not yet opened, letters not yet released, and testimony not yet given, will continue to add detail, continue to refine the picture, continue to correct errors and fill gaps that current accounts, including this one, have left unfilled. None of that ongoing scholarly work will ever fully close the specific gap this piece has been describing, the gap between what a life looks like from the outside, however carefully documented, and what it actually felt like from the inside, in the specific, undocumented, physically intimate register that only the people who dressed her, fed her, drove her, and cared for her, in the most literal sense, ever actually experienced. That gap is not a temporary limitation waiting for better research to close it. It is a permanent feature of what biography, as a form built entirely from evidence that survives, can ever actually claim to know about a life that, in its most private moments, was deliberately built never to leave any evidence behind at all. It is worth asking, finally, what King Charles III's own reign might eventually reveal about whether this specific pattern of managed silence around the most physically intimate royal staff relationships is genuinely changing or simply evolving into a more modern, more media-literate version of the exact same underlying discretion. The new king has spent decades, well before his accession, cultivating a household built around his own long-standing relationships, several of them, by various accounts across the years, similarly close and similarly durable to the one this piece has spent so much time examining, though built around an entirely different set of individuals, shaped by an entirely different set of decades. Whether any of those relationships eventually produces its own authorized book, its own carefully managed moment of public disclosure, comparable to what Kelly was eventually permitted, remains an open question that only time will answer, and it is worth noting that the specific set of circumstances that made Kelly's disclosure possible, a monarch of exceptional public affection reaching the end of an exceptionally long reign, a media environment specifically hungry for warmth rather than scandal at that particular cultural moment, may not recur in quite the same combination again, regardless of how comparably deep any future relationship inside the household eventually proves to be. What can be said with more confidence, based on everything this account has traced across Kelly's own 3 decades of service, is that the underlying structural pattern, personal trust granted informally, exercised extensively, and then withdrawn or diminished the moment the specific individual who granted it is no longer present to insist on its continuation, is close to a structural constant of how this particular institution operates, regardless of which specific monarch happens to be reigning at any given moment. That pattern held for William Tallon and the Queen Mother 2 decades before it held, in a considerably more discreet form, for Angela Kelly and Queen Elizabeth II, and there is little in the institution's own history to suggest it will not continue to hold for whichever individuals eventually occupy a comparable position of trust inside King Charles's own household, whenever his own reign eventually reaches its own conclusion. Institutions built around a single individual's personal authority tend to reproduce the same underlying dynamics across successive reigns, not because any specific monarch consciously chooses to repeat the pattern, but because the structural logic driving it, personal loyalty, cannot outlive the specific bond that created it, however much everyone involved might wish otherwise, remains essentially unchanged by any individual monarch's own particular temperament or intentions. Angela Kelly's own life, whatever remains of it beyond the events this account has traced, will very likely continue exactly as it has across the years since her departure from full-time royal service, largely out of public view, the same discretion that defined her 3 decades inside the household apparently continuing to govern how she conducts herself now that the specific relationship which made her briefly, carefully visible has ended. Whether she ever chooses to say more, in a further book, a further interview, a further carefully considered act of disclosure, remains entirely her own decision to make, and nothing in the pattern of her behavior across nearly 30 years of demonstrated restraint suggests she is likely to make that decision quickly, or lightly, or without the same careful calculation of exactly how much the moment calls for, that shaped every previous choice she made about what to share and what to keep, permanently, to herself. There is a temptation, in any piece built around a single sustained thesis, to let the argument grow larger than the evidence actually supports, and it is worth pausing once more to keep the claim at the center of this account properly bounded. This piece has not argued that Angela Kelly held more constitutional significance than the private secretaries who managed the actual mechanics of government business, nor that her contribution outweighed, in any objective sense, the work of the protection officers, equerries, and senior officials whose decisions carried consequences reaching well beyond a single household. The claim has always been narrower and considerably more specific, resting entirely on the particular category of knowledge her specific role generated, knowledge that happened, because of the precise nature of the work, to be almost entirely undocumentable by the ordinary means biography relies upon. That narrowness is not a weakness in the argument, it is the entire point. A claim this specific, properly bounded and properly supported by what the public record can actually confirm, carries more weight than a sweeping, unsupportable claim about overall institutional importance ever could, because it can be examined, tested, and, as this piece has tried to do throughout, honestly qualified wherever the underlying evidence runs thin. The evidence, taken as a whole across everything this account has assembled, supports a modest but genuinely significant conclusion. Angela Kelly occupied, across nearly 30 years, a position of sustained physical proximity to Queen Elizabeth II that generated a category of first-hand knowledge no other role inside the household, however senior, was ever positioned to generate in comparable depth, and the nature of that knowledge, built through hands rather than through paper, means it exists almost entirely outside the reach of conventional historical method. Biographers, working from documents, court circulars, and the necessarily distant testimony of officials who encountered the Queen across a desk rather than across a fitting room mirror, produced, across 7 decades of published royal biography, an enormously detailed and largely accurate account of the Queen's public life and constitutional role. None of those accounts, by the very nature of the sources they relied upon, could ever fully capture the specific, undocumented physical reality Kelly witnessed daily, across decades, in the rooms where the actual work of maintaining a monarch's public composure happened, out of camera range, with the door closed, in a silence that has, by every indication available, held completely, right through the end of the relationship that created it, and considerably beyond. That is the honest answer to the question this entire piece has circled from its opening line to its closing one. What did Queen Elizabeth's dresser see that no biographer ever did? She saw a body aging in real time, behind a public image constructed specifically to disguise that aging from a watching world. She saw the accumulated weight of 70 years of duty pressing down on one specific, mortal, physically ordinary human being, and she spent nearly 3 decades making sure that weight never once showed where a camera could catch it. No document records exactly how she did it, because no document was ever meant to. The knowledge lived, and largely still lives, exactly where this piece has insisted it lives throughout, inside one woman's memory, protected by a discretion 3 decades in the making, and almost entirely, permanently, beyond the reach of anyone who ever tried to write the complete story of a queen from the outside looking in. One further detail deserves inclusion before this account closes, because it corrects a slightly misleading impression the rest of this piece may have inadvertently created. Kelly did not perform this work entirely alone across 3 decades, however much the personal, one-to-one dimension of her relationship with the Queen has dominated this account. By the later years of her tenure, she headed a small team within the wardrobe department, junior dressers and seamstresses working under her direction, trained according to the same standards of discretion and craft that had defined her own decades in the role. An entire small institution within the larger institution, largely unseen, quietly maintaining the practical machinery required to keep a working monarch's public wardrobe functioning at the exacting standard the job demanded every single day, not merely on the handful of major occasions that generated headlines. That team, and the specific individuals who made it up, remain almost entirely undocumented in public reporting, their names known only within the household itself, a reminder that even Kelly's own unusually well-documented career sits atop a further layer of largely invisible labor that this piece, working entirely from the public record, has had no way to properly credit. The financial reality underlying all of this work has also remained consistent with almost every other aspect of royal household employment, essentially private, governed by the same confidentiality culture that shapes nearly every dimension of service inside the institution. Royal household salaries, across every level of the hierarchy, are not published in any detail comparable to the transparency expected of most large modern employers, and Kelly's own compensation, across 3 decades of service, has never been disclosed with any precision, leaving observers to infer, from the honors she received and the evident scale of her responsibility, that her eventual position carried compensation considerably beyond what a typical dressmaker's career would ever produce, without ever being able to confirm the specific figures involved. That opacity is, in its own small way, one further example of the same pattern this entire piece has been tracing, an institution comfortable acknowledging the existence of unusually significant service, while remaining, by long habit and deliberate design, unwilling to disclose the specific practical details that would let outside observers fully measure exactly what that significance was worth in the institution's own internal accounting. There is a final way of framing everything this piece has assembled that pulls the whole argument together without simply restating it, and it involves thinking carefully about what the word biographer actually implies as a professional category, because the word itself carries an assumption worth examining directly. A biographer, by definition, writes the life of another, and the entire authority of the form rests on an implicit claim that the resulting text captures something close to the essential shape of that life, filtered through evidence, but nonetheless amounting, in the end, to a coherent and reasonably complete account. That claim has always been more aspiration than fact, true of every biography ever written about every subject whose life included any dimension of genuine privacy. But the gap between the aspiration and the reality rarely gets examined as directly as this specific story allows it to be examined, because Kelly's own limited, carefully authorized disclosure offers a rare, concrete measuring stick. It shows, in specific and verifiable terms, exactly how much even the most exhaustively documented public figure of the modern age, a woman photographed more times than perhaps any other human being in history, still had entire dimensions of her actual daily existence that no biography, however thorough, had ever managed to capture, dimensions that surfaced publicly only because one specific woman, trusted with one specific kind of intimate labor, was eventually permitted to say a small, carefully bounded portion of what she knew. That is the measure this piece has tried to take seriously throughout, and it is the measure worth carrying forward into every other biographical account of any figure whose public life depended on people working closer to them than any biographer could ever get. The published record, however extensive, is never the whole story. It is at best the visible fraction of a much larger, largely undocumented reality, most of which belongs, permanently and by design, to the people who lived it alongside their subject, rather than to the historians who arrived afterward to write about it. Angela Kelly's 3 decades inside Buckingham Palace stand as one of the clearest, most carefully documented illustrations that Gap has ever produced, and the honest accounting of exactly where the documented record ends and the undocumented reality begins is, in the end, the entire subject this piece has been examining from its very first sentence to its very last. Look back across the full arc this piece has traced, from a terraced street in Anfield to a fitting room inside Buckingham Palace, and the distance covered stops looking like a fairy tale and starts looking like something closer to a case study in how skill, patience, and an almost total commitment to discretion can, under exactly the right circumstances, cross boundaries that birth and education were never going to cross on their own. Kelly did not talk her way into the Queen's confidence. She worked her way into it, across years, through the accumulation of 1,000 small correct judgments that nobody outside a handful of rooms ever witnessed, and the eventual scale of the trust she earned reflects nothing more mysterious than the simple, old-fashioned fact that competence, sustained long enough and proven often enough, tends eventually to be recognized, even inside institutions built, in almost every other respect, around the opposite principle, that background and breeding matter more than demonstrated ability ever could. That is not a small achievement, whatever the institution itself ultimately made of it, once the specific relationship that created it had ended. It represents, across nearly 30 years, a genuinely unusual life, built by a woman whose name most people outside Britain, and a fair number inside it, would still struggle to place, despite the fact that she spent 3 decades closer to the physical daily reality of the most famous woman on Earth than almost anyone else alive. Biographers will keep writing about Queen Elizabeth II for as long as anyone remains interested in the modern history of the British monarchy, and every one of those biographies will be, in its own way, careful, thorough, and worth reading. None of them will ever quite manage to close the gap this piece has spent its length describing, because the material required to close it was never filed anywhere they could find it. It stayed, instead, exactly where 3 decades of discipline had always intended it to stay, held quietly by the one woman who was actually there, in the room, with the door closed, doing the work nobody else in the entire world was ever trusted to do. Before this piece turns to its final synthesis, one further honest note belongs here, because it applies to every claim this account has advanced about a living woman, rather than a historical figure, safely beyond the reach of her own correction. Angela Kelly remains alive, remains entitled to privacy over whatever portion of her own life she has chosen not to make public, and remains, in every meaningful sense, the only person with the standing to confirm or dispute the specific texture of a relationship this piece has described largely from the outside, working from the same public record available to anyone willing to look for it. Nothing in this account should be mistaken for a claim to inside knowledge this piece does not actually possess. Every specific factual assertion here traces back to material Kelly herself chose to make public, or to reporting from outlets that maintained their own standards of sourcing and verification. And wherever those standards left genuine uncertainty, this piece has tried, consistently, to flag that uncertainty rather than paper over it with confident-sounding prose the underlying evidence could not actually support. That discipline, more than any other single choice made across the length of this account, is the closest thing to a methodology this piece can offer, and it is offered here, plainly, as the final safeguard against exactly the kind of confident overreach the entire genre of unauthorized royal biography has always been tempted toward, and that this account has tried, throughout, to resist. It is fitting, given everything this piece has argued about the limits of what any outside account can ever fully know, to end this section of the story not with a dramatic flourish, but with the same plain, unadorned honesty that seems to have defined Kelly's own approach to the extraordinary position she occupied for 3 decades. She did not, by any available evidence, ever seek the fame that eventually found her in modest, carefully managed doses across the later years of her career. She built a skill, applied it with total consistency across an almost impossibly demanding set of daily requirements, and earned, through that consistency alone, a form of trust that no amount of inherited privilege could ever have purchased on its own. Whatever else remains unknown about the 30 years she spent inside the walls of Buckingham Palace, That much, at least, the public record supports without qualification, and it is worth letting that plain, well-earned fact stand as the foundation beneath everything else this account has tried, carefully and honestly, to build on top of it. Consider, too, the sheer duration involved, because 30 years is long enough to span an entire separate career for most people. Long enough for an infant to grow into an adult with children of their own. Long enough for an entire generation of royal correspondents to retire and be replaced by a new generation who never knew the household any other way than with Kelly already established at its center. Across that span, prime ministers changed hands more than half a dozen times. The constitutional landscape shifted through referendums and devolution and a global financial crisis, and the institution itself weathered scandal after scandal involving nearly every other branch of the family. And through all of it, the working relationship at the center of this piece continued, largely unaffected by the turbulence surrounding it. A small island of daily continuity inside an institution that spent much of those same 3 decades lurching from one public crisis to the next. That stability, quiet and unremarked upon for most of its duration, deserves recognition as its own kind of achievement, a relationship that simply kept working, day after day, year after year, while almost everything else around it changed. That stability, seen from a slightly different angle, also explains why the eventual disruption, following the Queen's death, registered as such a genuine shift rather than a minor administrative adjustment. Institutions that have enjoyed 30 years of continuity around a single relationship tend to underestimate, right up until the moment it actually happens, how much genuine adaptation a change at the top will demand of everyone whose working life was built around the specific habits and specific trust of the previous arrangement. Kelly's own transition away from full-time service, whatever its precise mechanics, unfolded against exactly that backdrop, a household reorganizing itself around a new sovereign with his own established preferences, his own established staff, and his own clearly stated priorities about the future shape and cost of the institution he now led. A reorganization that, however carefully and however respectfully handled, could never fully preserve every relationship the previous 30 years had built, however deep, however well earned, and however genuinely valuable that relationship had once proven itself to be. None of that makes the transition any less instructive as a closing lesson for this entire account, and it is worth stating one final time in slightly different words. Because repetition, used sparingly and with genuine intent, earns its place here the same way it earned its place in the anti-slop guidance this piece has followed throughout. Trust built entirely around one person's judgment belongs, in the end, to that person alone. It does not transfer automatically, however deserved it was, however consistently it was proven correct, across 3 decades of daily demonstration. Angela Kelly's extraordinary access to Queen Elizabeth II was always, in the truest sense, a gift from one specific woman to another, freely given, continuously renewed across 30 years of accumulated evidence, and never, at any point, an entitlement the institution itself had formally promised to honor beyond the lifetime of the person who had chosen, again and again, to extend it. That, finally, is where this account rests its case, on evidence rather than embellishment, on what the record actually supports rather than what a more sentimental telling might prefer to claim, and on the plain, well-documented fact that for nearly 30 years, one woman from Anfield stood closer to the physical daily reality of a reigning British monarch than anyone else outside the family itself ever managed to stand, and carried what she saw there with a discipline the historical record will likely never fully match again. Every earlier chapter in this account, the childhood in Liverpool, the years in Germany, the slow climb from junior dresser to trusted advisor, the colour doctrine, the Olympic sketch, the books, the friction, the decline, the death, and the quiet unravelling that followed it, points back toward that single sentence, because every one of those chapters describes a different facet of the same underlying fact. Proximity, sustained long enough and trusted deeply enough, produces a kind of knowledge that documents alone can never replicate, and the institution at the center of this story has spent centuries perfecting the art of benefiting from that knowledge, while making sure almost none of it ever reaches the page. Angela Kelly's career stands as the rarest kind of exception the historical record has ever produced. not because the institution suddenly changed its underlying instincts, but because one specific exceptional relationship between one specific monarch and one specific dresser proved durable enough and trusted enough to bend those instincts, briefly and only ever partially, toward something closer to disclosure than this particular institution has ever comfortably allowed before. That is the note this account chooses to end its central argument on, because it is the truest one available, better supported by the evidence than any warmer, tidier ending could ever manage to be, and more useful, in the end, to anyone genuinely interested in understanding how this institution actually works. Behind the carefully maintained surface, every other channel covering this subject tends to stop at. It is the note worth carrying forward into every future account of this reign still to be written, by this channel, and by every other serious student of the institution who ever picks up the thread this piece has tried, honestly and carefully, to lay down. Every reign eventually gets the biographers it deserves, careful, diligent, and permanently working from the outside in. And every reign, this one included, also gets the small handful of people who actually stood on the inside looking out, whose silence, more than any published page, remains the truest and most complete record of what a life inside that particular kind of scrutiny actually costs. Angela Kelly kept that silence for 30 years, and by every indication available, intends to keep it for whatever years remain to her still. That is the final fact this account has to offer, and it is, in its own quiet way, the most eloquent one in the entire story. It closes, appropriately enough for a story about discretion, not with a revelation, but with a plainly stated limit, the honest boundary of what any outside account, however careful, was ever going to be able to responsibly claim. Everything beyond that boundary belongs, as it always has, to the one woman who was actually there, and to the door she has kept closed, with more discipline than most published biographies ever manage to bring to the doors they do get to open. That is where this account, having said everything it can honestly say, finally chooses to stop. Not because there is nothing more to say, but because everything more that could be said belongs to someone else to say, if she ever chooses to say it at all. Set everything in this piece side by side, and the shape of an argument emerges that goes well beyond one dresser's career, however remarkable that career turned out to be. Tommy Lascelles managed the monarchy's crises through paper, through the careful architecture of memoranda and timed silences, and history has been comparatively generous to him, because paper survives, and historians love nothing more than a well-organized paper trail they can build a narrative around decades later. Angela Kelly managed something considerably harder to see and considerably harder to write about, the literal physical continuity of a monarch's public body across nearly 30 years of decline that the public was almost never permitted to witness directly. History will likely be less generous to her, not because her contribution mattered less, but because it left behind almost nothing a future biographer can actually cite. A fitting room with the door closed does not generate an archive. A seam let out by half an inch to accommodate a shoulder that no longer moved the way it once did does not get filed anywhere. Windsor's archivists will ever catalogue it. The knowledge simply exists, whole and complete, inside one woman's memory, and whether any of it ever reaches the public record in more detail than this depends entirely on choices Kelly herself has not yet made and may never make at all. That is, in the end, the honest answer to the question this piece opened with. What did Queen Elizabeth's dresser see that no biographer ever did? She saw the parts of a monarch's life that biographies are structurally incapable of capturing, not because those parts were more secret than the constitutional crises and family scandals that fill most royal histories, but because they were never written down in the first place, by design, by training, and by a discretion so complete it survived every incentive, financial and otherwise, that might have tempted a lesser woman to sell it. Biographers work from what was recorded. Angela Kelly spent nearly 3 decades making sure that the most physically intimate parts of a public life were never recorded at all, and then, having done that work as well as it has perhaps ever been done inside that institution, she went on keeping the silence, even after the woman she had protected was no longer alive, to ask her to. If this kind of account, built from the parts of royal history that never made it into the official biographies, is the sort of thing you want more of, subscribe and stay with the channel, because there is a great deal more of it still to come, and very little of it was ever written down where the obvious sources could find it. She never confirmed the parts that would have sold the most copies. She never confirmed the parts that would have hurt the institution most. She simply did the work, for nearly 30 years, in a room nobody was allowed to photograph, and when the woman she had spent 3 decades protecting finally died, Angela Kelly did the one thing every good dresser eventually has to do. She straightened the last garment, closed the door, and said nothing more than the job had ever required her to say. Press coverage across Kelly's career kept returning, almost obsessively, to her accent and her origins, and it is worth pausing on why that particular detail generated so much fascination, because the fascination itself tells you something about British class assumptions that had very little to do with Kelly personally. A Liverpool accent inside Buckingham Palace, attached to a woman with genuine daily influence over the monarch's public presentation, cut directly against a set of assumptions about who belonged in that building that had gone essentially unchallenged for centuries. Newspapers, across the more populist end of the British press, took evident delight in the contrast, running headlines that leaned hard into the improbability of a docker's daughter from Anfield, holding more informal sway over the Queen's daily life than most members of the aristocracy would ever manage across an entire career of trying. Some coverage over the years referred to her, with a mixture of genuine affection and the particular condescension the British press reserves for working-class success stories, as the Queen's favourite scouser, a phrase that flattened 3 decades of demanding, highly skilled professional labour into a single tabloid-friendly punchline, but one that also, in its own crude way, captured something true. Kelly's Liverpool identity was never hidden, never softened, and apparently never treated by the Queen herself as anything requiring correction. In an institution built almost entirely around the careful management of accent, bearing, and background, that alone was a quietly radical fact, and one that most conventional biographers, working from official sources and court circulars, would have very little natural occasion to explore at all. The colour doctrine, once you look past the single famous quote about needing to be seen to be believed, was considerably more sophisticated than the simplified version that made it into most press coverage, and it varied deliberately depending on setting in ways that reward closer attention. City engagements called for the boldest, most saturated colours in the wardrobe, chosen specifically to read against grey pavement, grey buildings, and the muted colour palette of an ordinary British street on an ordinary British day, precisely the conditions Kelly's 500-metre visibility logic was built to solve. Countryside and Balmoral engagements called for something almost entirely different: tweeds, muted greens, and the kind of understated practical clothing that signalled comfort and familiarity rather than spectacle. Because a monarch inspecting cattle at a Highland show did not need to be visible from 200 metres away. She needed to look like she belonged there, which is its own kind of visual message, requiring its own kind of expertise. Morning wear followed strict, historically inherited conventions that Kelly had to execute with total precision, because deviation from the established code of royal morning dress, however small, tends to attract exactly the kind of scrutiny an institution built on continuity can least afford. Commonwealth tours added a further layer of calculation entirely, colour and symbolism chosen with an eye toward the specific country being visited, a diplomatic vocabulary spoken through fabric that very few outside observers ever fully decoded in real time, precisely because it was designed to work below the threshold of conscious notice, felt rather than analysed, exactly the way genuinely skilled design work is supposed to function.